Chapter 17. The Island and the Trastevere. Pont Quattro Capigitani Towers, Bartolomeo in Isola Temple of Aesculapius Hospital of the Benfratelli Mills, on the Tiber Pont Sestiofornarina's Houses Benedetto, Epicinuola Castle of the Alberteschi S. Crispino Palazzo Ponziani sta. Maria in Capella sta. Sicilia Hospital of S. Michel Porta Porti sta. Maria del Ordo S. Francesco, Arepa Castle of the Inquilera S. Crisogono Hospital of S. Gallicane sta. Maria in Trastevere S. Callisto Convent of sta. Anna S. Casamato Porta Sedimiana sta. Dorodia Pont Sisto. Following the road which leads to the Temple of Vesta, and C. as far as the Via Savelli, and then turning down past the gateway of the Orsini Palace, with its two bears we reach the Pont Quattro Capi. This was the ancient Pons Fabricius, built of stone in the place of a wooden bridge AUC. 733 by Fabricius the curator viarum. It has two arches with a small ornamental one in the central pier. In the 12th century the greater part was faced with brickwork. An inscription only partly legible remains, L. Fabricius, C.T. Kerr, Vier, faciundum curavit, idemc, probavit Q, lepidus, M.F.M. Lollius, M.F. Cos, X.S., C. probaverunt. From this inscription, the inference has been drawn that the Senate always allowed 40 years to elapse between the completion of a public work and the grant to it of their public approval. This bridge, according to Horace, was a favorite spot with those who wished to drown themselves. Hence Damasippus would have leaped into the Tiber, if it were not for the precepts of the Stoic Stertinius. Unde ego mira descripsi, docilis precepta hic, tempor quomi solidus jussit sapientum passere barbem, ac a Fabricio non tristum pont reverti. Horace Sat. Roman 2, 3. The name of the bridge changed with time to Pons Tarpius and Pons Judiorum, from the neighboring ghetto. It is now called Pont Quattro Capi, from two busts of the four-headed Janus, which adorn its parapet, and are supposed to have come from the temple of Janus Geminus, which stood in this neighborhood. On crossing this bridge, we are on the island in the Tiber, the formation of which is ascribed by tradition to the produce of the cornfields of the Tarquins, cast contemptuously upon the waters after their expulsion, which accumulated here till soil gathered around them and a solid piece of land was formed. Of this, Ampere says, Elefit du courant, rapide du fleuve, est plutot de détruire les îles, queden former. C'est ainsi qu'une petite île a été entraînée par la violence des eaux en 1718. Histoire Romaine à Rome. On this island, anciently known as the Isola Tibrina, were three temples, those, namely, of Aesculapius. Unde Coronidum circumfluit Tibrides, Alveo insula Romuli sacris, id siverit urbis. Ovid Medem, Roman 15, 624. Excepit phobo nymphac coronide natum insula, dividua quam premit amnes aqua. Ovid Fast, I 291. Of Jupiter. Jupiter in part est, sepit locus unius utrumc, junctec sunt magno templa nepotes avo. Ovid Fast, I 293. And of Faunus. Idibus agrestes fumant alteria fauni, hic ubi discretas insula rumpet aquas. Ovid Fast, Roman 2, 193. Here also was an altar to the Sabine god Semos Ancus, whose inscription, legible in the early centuries of Christianity, led various ecclesiastical authors into the error that the words Simoni Sanco referred to Simon Magus. In imperial times, the island was used as a prison. Among remarkable prisoners immured here was Arvandus, prefect of Gaul, AD 468. In the reign of Claudius 6 slaves were exposed and left to die here, that emperor by a strange contradiction in one who caused fallen gladiators to be butchered, for the pleasure of seeing them die, making a law that any slave so exposed should receive his liberty if he recovered. In the Middle Ages the island was under the jurisdiction of the Cardinal Bishop of Porto, who lived in the Franciscan convent. Under Leo X, a fete was held here in which Camillo Cuerno, the papal poet, was crowned with ivy, laurel, and cabbage. In 1656 the whole island was appropriated as a hospital for those stricken with the plague singular coincidence for the site of the temple of Aesculapius. The first building on the left after passing the bridge is a fine brick tower, of great historic interest, as the only relic of a castle, built by the family of the Anasii, of which Saint Gregory the Great was a member, and 2 of whom were consuls together under Honorius. Est in Romuleo procumbens insula Tibri, qua medius geminas interfluit alveus urbs, discretas subunt Frido. Paradirc menantes ardua turigeri surgunt in culmina ripi. Hic stetit et subitum prospixit ob agur vatum, unanimes fraters junctos stipante senetu ire forum, strictesc procul radire secures, ac uno bijuges tolli de limine facies. Claudius Painig, in prob et olib, cons. 226. From the Anacii the castle passed to the Gitani. It was occupied as a fortress by the Countess Matilda after she had driven the faction of the anti-pope Guibert out of the island, and was the refuge where 2 successive popes, Victor Roman III and Urban Roman II, lived under her protection. The center of the island is now occupied by the church and convent of S. Bartolomeo, which gives it its present name. The piazza in front of the church is occupied by a pillar, erected at the private expense of Pius Roman IX, to commemorate the opening of the Vatican Council of 1869-70, adorned with statues of St. Bartholomew, St. Paulinus of Nola, St. Francis, and S. Giovanni di Dio. Here formerly stood an ancient obelisk, the only one of unknown origin. A fragment of it was long preserved at the Villa Albani, whence it is said to have been removed to Urbino. The church, a basilica, was founded by Otho Roman III, c. 1000. Its campanile dates from 1118. The nave and aisles are divided by red granite columns, said to be relics of the ancient temple, as is a marble wellhead under the stairs leading to the tribune. This was restored in 1798 and dedicated to Saint Adalbert of Nessin, who bestowed upon the church its great relic, the body of Saint Bartholomew, which he asserted to have brought from Beneventum, though the inhabitants of that town profess that they still possess the real body of the apostle, and sent that of Saint Paulinus of Nola to Rome instead. The dispute about the possession of this relic ran so high as to lead to a siege of Beneventum in the Middle Ages. The convent belongs to the Franciscans, frati minori, who will admit male visitors into their pretty little garden at the end of the island to see the remains of the Temple of Aesculapius, built after the Great Plague in Rome in B.C. 291, when, in accordance with the advice of the Sibylline books, ambassadors were sent to Epidaurus to bring Aesculapius to Rome. They returned with a statue of the god, but as their vessel sailed up the Tiber, a serpent, which had lain concealed during the voyage, glided from it, and landed on this spot, hailed by the people under the belief that Aesculapius himself had thus come to them. In consequence of this story, the form of a ship was given to this end of the island, and its bow may still be seen at the end of the convent garden, with the famous serpent of Aesculapius sculptured upon it in high relief. The curious remains still existing are not of sufficient size to bear out the assertion often made that the whole island was enclosed in the travertine form of a ship, of which the temple of Jupiter at the other end afterwards formed the prow, and the obelisk the mast. Pendant les guerres samnites, Rome fut de nouveau frappé par une de ces maladies auxquelles elle était souvent en proie, celle-ci duratoire années. On ut recurs aux livres sibyllins. En casperil ils aviant prescrit de consacra un temple à Apollon, set fois ils prescriverant dollar à Epidora churcher la fils d'Apollon, Esculape, et de Elamina à Rome. Esculape, sous la forme d'un serpent, fut transporté d'Epidora dans l'île Tiberine, où on lui élève un temple, et où ont été trouvés des exvodes, représentant des bras, des jambes, diverses autres parties du corps humain, exvodos quan out pour croire provenir d'une église de Rome. Car le catholicisme romain a adapté cet usage païen sans wyrene changer. Pourquoi place-t-on le temple d'Esculape en cet endroit? En avouque à l'île Tiberine avait été très anciennement consacré au culte d'un des latins primitifs, Faunus, or si de rendate ses oracles prise des sources thermales. Its devant avoir souvent pour l'objet la guérison des malades qui venient demander la santé à ces sources. De plus, les malades consultant Esculape dans les songes par incubation, comme dans l'Ovid, numava consulter Faunus sur l'Aventin. Il ns donc pas surprenant quan est institué le culte du dieu grec de la santé, la où le latin Faunus rendate ses oracles dans des songs, et où étant probablement des sources do show qui ont disparu, comme les lochly prise du forum romain. On donna à elle la forme d'un vaisseau, plus tard un obélisque figure la mat, en le regardant du pont rado, en reconnaît encore très bien cette forme, de cicate, en voit sculpté sur le mur qui figure le vaisseau d'Esculape, une image du dia avec un serpent entortillé autour de son sceptre. La belle statue d'Esculape, venue des jardins farnis, passe pour avoir été celle de l'île Tibérine. Un temple de Jupiter touchait à si temple d'Esculape. Un jour que j'y visitais Silou, le sacristain de l'église de Saint Barthélemy me dit, al tempo d'Esculapio quando giovrignava, phrase singulière, et qui monter encore vivante une sorte de foio paganismi chez les Romans. Ampere, Roman 3. 42. Opposite S. Bartolomeo, on the site of the Temple of Faunus, is the Hospital of S. Giovanni Calabita, also called Benfratelli, entirely under the care of the Brethren of S. Giovanni di Dio, who cook, nurse, wash, and otherwise do all the work of those who pass under their care, often to the number of 1,200 in the course of the year, though the hospital is very small. C'est apaivi quelles frères de l'ordre de la Charité, institué par Saint Jean de Dieu, durant leur premier établissement à Rome. Au milieu du cortège triomphal qui accompagnait Don Juan d'Autriche, 1571, lors de son retour de la Ponte, on remarquait un pauvre homme misérablement vertu et à l'attitude modeste. Il s'y nommait Sébastien Arias des frères de Jean de Dieu. Jean de Dieu tate mort sans laisser daughter régler ses disciples, quasies tachantes paroles quil repetate sans cesse. Fates le bien, mes frères. Et Sébastien Darius venait à Rome pour demander au pape l'autorisation de former des couvents, et de voir des hospices où ils poussent, suivre les exemples de dévouement, que leur avait laissés Jean de Dieu. Or, Sébastien rencontre Don Juan à Naples, et le vainqueur de la Ponte le prit avec lui. Il s'y chargia merme de payer sa requête, et pivi s'empressa de corder aux frères non seulement la boule quils desirant, mais encore un monastre dans l'île du Tiber. Gurnery, Rome Creation, Roman 2, 206. A narrow lane near this leads to the other end of the island, where the temple of Jupiter stood. It is worthwhile to go thither for the sake of the view of the river and its bridges, which is to be obtained from a little quay leading to one of the numerous watermills which exist near this. These floating mills, which bear sacred monograms upon their gables, are interesting as having been invented by Belisarius in order to supply the people and garrison with bread during the siege of Rome by Vitiges, when the Goths had cut the aqueducts, and thus rendered the mills on the Janiculum useless. The bridge of one large and two smaller arches, which connects the island with the Trastevere, is now called the Pont S. Bartolomeo, but was anciently the Pons Cestius, or Gratianus, built AUC 708 by the praetor Lucius Cestius, who was probably father to the Caius Cestius buried near the Porta S. Paolo. It was restored AD 370 by the emperors Valentinian, Valens, and Gratian, as is seen from the fragments of a red letter inscription on the inside of the parapet, in which the title, Pontifex Maximus, is ascribed to each tide accepted without hesitation, says Gibbon, by 7 Christian emperors, who were invested with more absolute authority over the religion they had deserted than over that which they professed. We now enter the Trastevere, the city across the Tiber, the portion of Rome which is most unaltered from medieval times, and whose narrow streets are still overlooked by many ancient towers, Gothic windows, and curious fragments of sculpture. The inhabitants on this side differ in many respects from those on the other side of the Tiber. They pride themselves upon being born Trasteverini, profess to be the direct descendants of the ancient Romans, seldom intermarry with their neighbors, and speak a dialect peculiarly their own. It is said that in their dispositions also they differ from the other Romans, that they are far more hasty, passionate, and revengeful, as they are a stronger and more vigorous race. The proportion of murders, a crime far less common in Rome than in England, is larger in this than in any other part of the city. This, it is believed, is partly due to the extreme excitement which the Trasteverini display in the pursuit of their national games, especially that of Mora. Mora is played by the men and merely consists in holding up, in rapid succession, any number of fingers they please, calling out at the same time the number their antagonist shows. Nothing, seemingly, can be more simple or less interesting. Yet, to see them play, so violent are their gestures that you would imagine them possessed by some diabolical passion. The eagerness and rapidity with which they carry it on render it very liable to mistake and altercation. Then frenzy fires them, and too often furious disputes arise at this trivial play that end in murder. Mora seems to differ in no respect from the Micerdigitis of the ancient Romans. Eaton's Rome. A house with Gothic windows on the right, soon after passing the bridge, is pointed out as that once inhabited by the Fornarina, beloved of Raphael, and so well known to us from his portrait of her in the Tribune at Florence. Crossing the Via Longarina, we find ourselves in the little piazza of S. Benedetto a Pisanuola, where there is a tiny church, with a good brick campanile intersected by terracotta moldings, which occupies the site of the house inhabited by Saint Benedict before his retreat to Subiaco. The exterior is uninviting, but the interior very curious. An atrium with antique columns opens to a vaulted chapel of the same design as the Orto del Paradiso at Sta. Prassed, in which is a picture of the Virgin and Child, revered as that before which Saint Benedict was wont to pray. Hence is entered the cell of the saint, of rough-hewn stones. His stone pillow is shown. The church has ancient pillars and a rich opus Alexandrinum pavement. Over the high altar is a picture full length of Saint Benedict, which Mabillon, Iter Italicum, considers a genuine contemporary portrait, though Nibby and other critics suppose it less ancient. The figure on gold background is seated in a chair with Gothic carvings, such as were in medieval use. The black cowl is drawn over the head, the hair and beard are white. The aspect is serious and thoughtful, in one hand a crozier, in the other the book of rules drawn up by the saint, displaying the words with which they begin. Ausculta fili precepta magistri. Hemin's ancient sacred art. Turning down the Via Longarina towards the river, we pass, on the left, considerable remains of the old medieval castle of the Alberteschi family, consisting of a block of palatial buildings of handsome masonry, with numerous antique fragments built into them, and a very rich porch sculptured with egg and billet moldings of c.A.D. 1150. And beyond these, separated from them by a modern street, a high brick tower of c.A.D. 1100. Above one of the windows of this tower, a head of Jupiter is engrafted in the wall. We now reach the entrance of the Pont Rotto, described Chapter V. Close to this bridge is the church of S. Crispino al Pont. The saint is buried at S. Lorenzo Pane e Perna. The front is modernized, but the east end displays rich terracotta cornices and is very picturesque. On the riverbank below this are the colossal lions' heads mentioned in Chapter V. Turning up the Via dei Vassalari, we pass on the right, the ancient palace of the Ponziani family, once magnificent, but now of humble and rude exterior, and scarcely to be distinguished, except in March, during the Festa of Sta. Francesca Romana, when old tapestries are hung out upon its whitewashed walls, and the street in front is thickly strewn with box leaves. The modern building that has been raised on the foundation of the old palace is the Casa dei Esercizi for the young men of the city. They're the repentant sinner who longs to break the chain of sin, the youth beset by some strong temptation, one who has heard the inward voice summoning him to higher paths of virtue, another who is in doubt as to the particular line of life to which he is called, may come and leave behind him for 3 or 5 or 10 days. As it may be, the busy world with all its distractions and its agitations, and free for the time being from temporal cares, the wants of the body being provided for. And the mind at rest may commune with God and their own souls. Over the Casa dei Esercizi, the sweet spirit of Francesca seems still to preside. On the day of her festival, its rooms are thrown open, every memorial of the gentle saint is exhibited, lights burn on numerous altars, flowers deck the passages, leaves are strewn in the chapel, on the stairs, in the entrance court. Gay carpets, figured tapestry, and crimson silks hang over the door, and crowds of people go in and out, and kneel before the relics or the pictures of the dear saint of Rome. It is a touching festival, which carries back the mind to the day when the young bride of Lorenzo Ponziano entered these walls for the first time, in all the sacred beauty of holiness and youth. Lady G. Fullerton. In this house also, Sta. Francesca Romana died, having come hither from her convent to nurse her son who was ill, and having been then seized with mortal illness herself. Touching were the last words of the dying mother to her spiritual children. Love, love, was the burden of her teaching, as it had been that of the beloved disciple. Love one another, she said, and be faithful unto death. Satan will assault you as he has assaulted me, but be not afraid. You will overcome him through patience and obedience, and no trial will be too grievous if you are united to Jesus. If you walk in his ways, he will be with you. On the 7th day of her illness, as she had herself announced, her life came to a close. A sublime expression animated her face, a more ethereal beauty clothed her earthly form. Her confessor for the last time inquired what it was her enraptured eyes beheld, and she answered, "The heavens open, the angels descend, the angel has finished his task. He stands before me, he beckons me to follow him." These were the last words Francesca uttered. Lady G. Fullerton's Life of Sta, F. Romana. Almost opposite the Ponziani Palace, an alley leads to the small chapel of Sta Maria in Capella, which has a good brick campanile, dating from 1090. This building is attached to a hospital for poor women ill of incurable diseases, attended by Sisters of Charity, and entirely under the patronage of the Doria family. We now reach the front of the convent and church of Sta Cecilia, facing which is a picturesque medieval house, in many ways one of the most interesting buildings in the city. Cecilia was a noble and rich Roman lady who lived in the reign of Alexander Severus. She was married at 16 to Valerian, a heathen with whom she lived in perpetual virginity, telling him that her guardian angel watched over her by day and night. "I have an angel which thus loveth me that with great love, whether I wake or sleep, is ready I my body for to keep." Chaucer. At length, Valerian and his brother Tiburtius were converted to Christianity by her prayers, and the exhortations of Pope Urban I, the husband and brother, were beheaded for refusing to sacrifice to idols, and Cecilia was shortly afterwards condemned by Almachius, prefect of Rome, who was covetous of the great wealth she had inherited by their deaths. She was first shut up in the sudatorium of her own baths, and a blazing fire was lighted, that she might be destroyed by the hot vapors. But when the bath was opened, she was found still living, for God, says the legend, had sent a cooling shower which had tempered the heat of the fire and preserved the life of the saint. Almachius, then, who dreaded the consequences of bringing so noble and courageous a victim to public execution, sent a lictor to behead her in her own palace. But he executed his office so ill that she still lived after the third blow of his axe, after which the Roman law forbade that a victim should be stricken again. The Christians found her bathed in her blood, and during 3 days she still preached and taught like a doctor of the church, with such sweetness and eloquence that 400 pagans were converted. On the 3rd day she was visited by Pope Urban, to whose care she tenderly committed the poor whom she nourished, and to him she bequeathed the palace in which she had lived, that it might be consecrated as a temple to the Savior. Then, thanking God that he considered her, a humble woman, worthy to share the glory of his heroes, and with her eyes apparently fixed upon the heavens opening before her, she departed to her heavenly bridegroom upon the 22nd November, AD 280. The foundation of the church dates from its consecration by Pope Urban I, after the death of Saint Cecilia, but it was rebuilt by Paschal I in 821 and miserably modernized by Cardinal Doria in 1725. The exterior retains its ancient campanile of 1120 and its atrium of marble pillars, evidently collected from pagan edifices and surmounted by a frieze of mosaic, in which medallion heads of Cecilia, Valerian, Tiburtius, Urban I, and others are introduced. In the courtyard of the convent, which belongs to Benedictine nuns, is a fine specimen of the Roman vase called cantharis, perhaps coeval with Saint Cecilia's own residence here. Right of the door, on entering, is the tomb of Adam of Hertford, Bishop of London, who died 1398, the only one spared from a cruel death, of the cardinals who conspired against Urban Roman VI, and were taken prisoners at Lucera from fear of King John, who was his friend. His sarcophagus is adorned with the arms of England, then 3 leopards and fleurs de lis quartered. On the opposite side of the entrance is the tomb of Cardinal Fortigera, conspicuous in the contests of Pius Roman II and Paul Roman II, with the Malatestas and Savellis in the 15th century. The drapery is a beautiful specimen of the delicate carving of detail during that period. The altar canopy, which bears the name of its artist, Arnulfus, and the date 1286, is a fine specimen of Gothic work, and has statuettes of Cecilia, Valerian, Tiburtius, and Urban. Beneath the altar is the famous statue of Saint Cecilia. In the archives of the Vatican remains an account written by Pope Paschal I, AD 817-24 himself, describing how, yielding to the infirmity of the flesh, he fell asleep in his chair during the early morning service at St. Peter's, with his mind preoccupied with a longing to find the burial place of Cecilia and discover her relics. Then, in a glorified vision, the Virgin Saint appeared before him and revealed the spot where she lay, with her husband and brother-in-law, in the catacomb of Calixtus, and there they were found and transported to her church on the following day. In the 16th century, Esfandrato, titular cardinal of the church, opened the tomb of the martyr, when the embalmed body of Cecilia was found, as it had been previously found by Paschal, robed in gold tissue with linen clothes steeped in blood at her feet, not lying upon the back like a body in a tomb, but upon its right side like a virgin in her bed, with her knees modestly drawn together and offering the appearance of sleep. Pope Clement Roman VIII. And all the people of Rome rushed to look upon the saint, who was afterwards enclosed as she was found, in a shrine of cypress wood cased in silver. But before she was again hidden from sight, the greatest artist of the day, Stefano Maderno, was called in by Esfandrato to sculpture the marble portrait which we now see lying upon her grave. Esfandrato, whose tomb is in this church, also enriched her shrine with the 96 silver lamps which burn constantly before it. In regarding this statue, it will be remembered that Cecilia was not beheaded, but wounded in the throat. A gold circlet conceals the wound. In the statue, the body lies on its side, the limbs a little drawn up. The hands are delicate and fine. They are not locked, but crossed at the wrists. The arms are stretched out. The drapery is beautifully modeled and modestly covers the limbs. It is the statue of a lady, perfect in form, and affecting from the resemblance to reality in the drapery of white marble and the unspotted appearance of the statue altogether. It lies as no living body could lie, and yet correctly, as the dead when left to expire, I mean in the gravitation of the limbs. Sir C. Bell. The inscription says, "Behold the body of the most holy Virgin Cecilia, whom I myself saw lying incorrupt in her tomb. I have in this marble expressed for thee the same saint in the very same posture of body." The tribune is adorned with mosaics of the 9th century, erected in the lifetime of Paschal I. See his square nimbus. The Savior is seen in the act of benediction, robed in gold. At his side are SS. Peter and Paul, Saint Cecilia and Saint Valerian, Saint Paschal I carrying the model of his church, and Saint Agatha, whom he joined with Cecilia in its dedication. The mystic palm trees and the phoenix, the emblem of eternity, are also represented, and beneath, the 4 rivers and the 12 sheep, emblematical of the apostles, issuing from the gates of Bethlehem and Jerusalem to the adoration of the spotless Lamb. The picture of Saint Cecilia behind the altar is attributed to Guido. At the end of the right aisle is an ancient fresco representing the dream of Pope Paschal the mitred, Pope asleep upon his throne, and the saint appearing before him in a rich robe adorned with gems. This is the last of a series of frescoes which once existed in the portico of the church. The rest were destroyed in the 17th century. There are copies of them in the Barberini Library, viz., the marriage feast of Valerian and Cecilia. Cecilia persuades Valerian to seek for Saint Urban. Valerian rides forth to seek for Urban. Valerian is baptized. An angel crowns Cecilia and Valerian. Cecilia converts her executioners. Cecilia suffers in the bath. The martyrdom of Cecilia, the burial of Cecilia, the dream of Paschal. Opening out of the same aisle are 2 chambers in the house of Saint Cecilia. One the sudatorium of her baths, in which she was immured, actually retaining the pipes and calorifers of an ancient Roman bath. The Festa of Saint Cecilia is observed in this church on November 22nd, when Rapt Cecilia, seraph-haunted Queen of Harmony, is honored in beautiful music from the papal choir assembled here. Visitors to Bologna will recollect the glorious figure of Saint Cecilia by Raphael, wrapped in ecstasy and surrounded by instruments of music. This association with Cecilia probably arises from the tradition of the Church, which tells how Valerian, returning from baptism by Pope Urban, found her singing hymns of triumph for his conversion, of which he had supposed her to be ignorant, and that when the bath was opened after her 3 days' imprisonment, she was again found singing the praises of her Savior. It is said that she sang with such ravishing sweetness that even the angels descended from heaven to listen to her or to join their voices with hers. The antiphons sung upon her festival are, "And Cecilia, thy servant, serves thee, O Lord, even as the bee that is never idle. I bless thee, O Father of my Lord Jesus Christ, for through thy Son the fire hath been quenched round about me. I asked of the Lord a respite of 3 days, that I might consecrate my house as a church. O Valerian, I have a secret to tell thee. I have for my lover an angel of God, who, with great jealousy, watches over my body. The glorious Virgin ever bore the gospel of Christ in her bosom, and neither by day nor night ceased from conversing with God in prayer." And the anthem. While the instruments of music were playing, Cecilia sang unto the Lord and said, "Let my heart be undefiled, that I may never be confounded." And Valerianus found Cecilia praying in her chamber with an angel. It will be remembered that Cecilia is one of the chosen saints daily commemorated in the canon of the Mass. Nobis quoque peccatoribus familiae tuis de multitudine miserationem tuorum sperentibus, partem aliquem et societatem donner digneris cum tuis sanctis apostolis et martyribus. Cum Joanne, Stefano, Matthia, Barnaba, Ignatio, Alexandro, Marcelino, Petro, Felicitate, Perpetua, Agata, Lucia, Agnete, Cecilia, Anastasia, et omnibus sanctis. Just beyond St. Cecilia is the immense hospital of S. Michel, founded by Cardinal Odescalchi, nephew of Innocent I, in 1693, as a refuge for vagabond children, where they might be properly brought up and taught a trade. Innocent Roman 12. Pignatelli added to this foundation a hospital for sick persons of both sexes, and each succeeding pope has increased the buildings and their endowment. The establishment is now divided into an asylum for old men and women, a school with ateliers for boys and girls, and a penitentiary, Casa del Don Captive. A large church was attached to the hospital by Leo Roman 12. No old men are admitted who have not inhabited Rome for 5 years. If they are still able to work, a small daily task is given to them. The old women, as long as they can work, are obliged to mend and wash the linen of the establishment. The boys, for the most part orphans, are received at the age of 11. The girls receive a dowry of 300 francs if they marry, but double that sum if they consent to enter a convent. A printing press is attached to the hospital. S. Michel occupies the site of the sacred grove of the goddess Furina, not of the Furies, where Caius Gracchus was killed, BC 123. Protected by his friends, he escaped from the Aventine, where he had first taken refuge, and crossed the ponds Sublicious. A single slave reached the grove of Furina with him, who, having in vain sought for a horse to continue their flight, first slew his master and then himself. One Septimius then cut off the head of Gracchus, and a proclamation having been issued that anyone who brought the head of Caius Gracchus should receive its weight in gold first filled it with lead, and then carried it on a spear to the consul Opimius, who paid him his blood money. At the end of this street is the Porta Portis, built by Urban Roman 8, through which runs the road to Porto and Fiumicino. Outside this gate was the site of the camp of Tarquin, afterwards given by the Senate to Mutius Scaevola, for his bravery in the camp of Lars Porsena. The vineyards here have an interest to Roman Catholics as the scene of one of the miracles attributed to Sta. Francesca Romana. One fine sunny January day, Francesca and her companions had worked since dawn in the vineyards of the Porta Portis. They had worked hard for several hours, and then suddenly remembered that they had brought no provisions with them. They soon became faint and hungry, and above all, very thirsty. Perna, the youngest of all the oblates, was particularly heated and tired, and asked permission of the Mother Superior to go to drink water at a fountain some way off on the public road. "Be patient, my child," Francesca answered, and they went on with their work. But Francesca, withdrawing aside, knelt down and said, "Lord Jesus, I have been thoughtless in forgetting to provide food for my sisters. Help us in our need." Perna, who had kept near the Mother Superior, said to herself, with some impatience, "It would be more to the purpose to take us home at once." Then Francesca, turning to her, said, "My child, you do not trust in God, look up and see." And Perna saw a vine entwined around a tree, whose dead and leafless branches were loaded with grapes. In speechless astonishment the oblates assembled around the tree, for they had all seen its bare and withered branches. 20 times at least they had passed before it, and the season for grapes was gone by. There were exactly as many bunches as persons present. See Lady G. Fullerton's Life of Sta. F. Romana. From the back of S. Michel, a cross street leads to the Church of Sta. Maria del Orto, designed by Giulio Romano, c. 1530, except the façade, which is by Martino Lunghai. The high altar is by Giacomo della Porta. The church contains an Annunciation by Taddeo Zuccaro. Sed église appartient à plusieurs corporations. Chacune a sa tom devant sa propre chapelle, et sur le couvercle sont gravés ses armes particulières. Un coq sur la tombe des marchands de Valil, une pantoufle sur celle des savetiers, des artichauts sur celle des jardiniers, and c. Row below. Close to this, at the end of the street which runs parallel with S. Michel, is the church of S. Francesco Aripa, the novitiate of the Franciscans Frati Minori. The convent contains the room, approached through the church, in which St. Francis lived during his visits at Rome, with many relics of him. His stone pillow and his crucifix are shown, and a picture of him by G. de Lettisali. An altar in his chamber supports a reliquary in which 18,000 relics are displayed. The church was rebuilt soon after the death of St. Francis by the knight Pandolfo d'Anquilera. His castle is in the Via Lungaretta, whose tomb is in the church, with his figure, in the dress of a Franciscan monk, which he assumed in the latter part of his life. It was again rebuilt by Cardinal Pallavicini, from designs of Matteo Rossi. Among its pictures are the Virgin and Saint Anne by Basixio, the Nativity by Simon Vowet, and a Dead Christ by Annibale Carracci. On the left of the altar is the Altieri Chapel, in which is a recumbent statue of the Blessed Luigi Albertoni by Bernini. In the third chapel on the right is a mummy, said to be that of the Virgin Martyr Sta. Simplicia. The convent garden has some beautiful palm trees. Following the Via Morticelli, we regain the Via Lungaretta near S. Benedetto. This street, more than any other in Rome, retains remnants of medieval architecture. On the right, opposite the opening to the west end of S. Crisagono, is the entrance to the old castle of the Angalera family, of whom were Count Pandolfo d'Angalera already mentioned, and Averso, his grandson, celebrated for his highway robberies between Rome and Viterbo in the 15th century. Also Orso d'Angalera, senator of Rome, who crowned Petrarch at the Capitol on Easter Day, 1341. The family device, 2 crossed eels, surmounted by a helmet, and a wild boar holding a serpent in his mouth, is believed to refer to the story of the founder of their house, Malagrata, a second Saint George, who slew a terrible serpent, which had devastated the district round his abode, and received in recompense from the Pope the gift of as much land as he could walk round in one day. The existing remains consist of an arch, called El Arco del Annunziata, and a brick tower, which is now in the possession of a Signor Forti, who exhibits here, during Epiphany, a remarkably pretty presepio, in which the Holy Family and the shepherds are seen backed by the real landscape. For those who witness this sight, it will be interesting to turn to the origin of a presepio. St. Francis asked, with his usual simplicity, to be allowed to celebrate Christmas with certain unusual ceremonies, which had suggested themselves to him, ceremonies which he must have thought likely to seize upon the popular imagination and impress the unlearned folk. He would not do it on his own authority, we are told, lest he should be accused of levity. When he made this petition, he was bound for the village of Grecia, a little place not far from Assisi, where he was to remain during that sacred season. In this village, when the eve of the Nativity approached, Francis instructed a certain grave and worthy man, called Giovanni, to prepare an ox and an ass, along with a manger and all the common fittings of a stable, for his use in the church. When the solemn night arrived, Francis and his brethren arranged all these things into a visible representation of the occurrences of the night at Bethlehem. The manger was filled with hay, the animals were led into their places. The scene was prepared as we see it now through all the churches of southern Italia reproduction, so far as the people know how, in startling realistic detail of the surroundings of the first Christmas. We are told that Francis stood by this, his simple theatrical, for such, indeed, it was no shame to him, representation, all the night long, sighing for joy and filled with an unspeakable sweetness. Mrs. Oliphant, St. Francis. On the left is the fine church of S. Crisagono, founded by Pope Sylvester, but rebuilt in 731 and again by Cardinal Scipio Borghese, who modernized so many of the old churches in 1623. The tower is medieval rebuilt, but spoilt by whitewash. The portico has 4 ancient granite columns. The interior is a basilica, the nave being separated from the aisles by 22 granite columns, and the tribune from the nave by 2 magnificent columns of porphyry. The baldacchino of graceful proportions rests on pillars of yellow alabaster. Over the tabernacle is a picture of the Virgin and Child by the cave, d'Arpino. The mosaic in the tribune, probably only the fragment of a larger design, represents the Madonna and Child enthroned, between St. James the Great and St. Chrysogonus. The stalls are good specimens of modern wood carving. Near the end of the right aisle is the modern tomb of Anna Maria Tegi, lately beatified and likely to be canonized, though readers of her life will find it difficult to imagine why, the great point of her character being that she was a good wife to her husband, though he was ruvido di maniere e grossolano. Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury, was titular cardinal of this church. S. Chrysogono, represented in the mosaic as a young knight, stood by Sta. Anastasia during her martyrdom, exhorting her to patient endurance. He was afterwards himself beheaded under Diocletian, and his body thrown into the sea. In 1866, an excubatorium of the Vieth cohort of Vigils, a station of Roman firemen, was discovered near this church. Several chambers were tolerably perfect. On the left, we pass the Hospital of S. Gallicano, founded by Benedict Roman XIII. Orsini, in 1725, as is told by the inscription over the entrance, for the Negoctis rejectisque ab omnibus. The interior contains 2 long halls opening into one another, the first containing 120 beds for men, the second 88 for women. Patients affected with maladies of the skin are received here to the number of 100. The principal treatment is by means of baths, which gives the negative within these walls to the Italian saying that an ancient Roman took as many baths in a week as a modern Roman in all his life. The establishment is at present under the management of the Benfratelli, Fate Beni Fratelli. S. Gallicano, to whom the hospital is dedicated, was a Benfratelo of the time of Constantine, who devoted his time and his fortune to the poor. At the upper end of the Via Lungaretta is a piazza with a very handsome fountain, on one side of which is the Church of Sta. Maria in Trastevere, supposed to be the first church in Rome dedicated to the Virgin. It was founded by Saint Calixtus in A.D. 224 on the site of the Taberna Meritoria, an asylum for old soldiers, where, according to Don Cassius, a fountain of pure oil sprang up at the time of our Saviour's birth and flowed away in one day to the Tiber, a story which gave the name of Fons Oli to the church in early times. It is said that wine sellers and tavern keepers, Papanarii, disputed with the early Christian inhabitants for this site, upon which the latter had raised some kind of humble oratory, and that they carried their complaint before Alexander Severus, when the emperor awarded the site to the Christians, saying, "I prefer that it should belong to those who honor God, whatever be their form of worship." Si souvenir augment encore l'interieur, qui est attaché à l'église de Santa Maria in Trastevere. Les colons antiques de granit Egyptian de cette basilique, et les belles mosaiques qui la décorent mi touchant moins, que la tradition d'après laquelle elle fut élevée, là de pauvres créations, si rassemblant dans un cabaret purifié par leur piété. Pour y célèbre le culte, qui devait un jour étaler ses magnificences, sous le dôme resplendissant de Saint-Pierre. Ampere, Emp. Roman II, 318. The church was rebuilt in 340 by Julius I, and after a series of alterations was again almost entirely reconstructed in 1139 by Innocent Roman II, as a thanksgiving offering for the submission of the antipope, Eugenius Roman III. 1140-550 finished what was left uncompleted, but the new basilica was not consecrated till the time of Innocent Roman III. 1190-1216. The tower, apse, tribune, and mosaics belong to the early Restoration. The rest is due to alterations made by Bernardino Rossellini for Nicholas V. The west facade is covered with mosaics, the upper part representing the Savior throned between angels and the lower of palms, the 12 sheep, and the Mystic Cities are additions by Pius Roman IX. In 1869, The central frieze was begun in the 12th century under Eugenius Roman III and completed in the 14th by Pietro Cavallini. It represents the Virgin and Child enthroned in the midst, and 10 female figures, generally described as the 10 virgins, but Hemans remarks. It is evident that such subject cannot have been in the artist's thoughts, as each stately figure advances towards the throne with the same devout aspect and graceful serenity, the same faith and confidence. The sole observable distinctions being that the two with unlit lamps are somewhat more matronly, their costumes simpler, than is the case with the rest, and that instead of being crowned, as are the others, these two wear veils. Explanation of such attributes may be found in the mystic meaning, the light being appropriate to virgin saints, the oil taken to signify benevolence or almsgiving, and we may conclude that those without light represent wives or widows, the others virgin saints in this group. 2 other diminutive figures, the scale indicating humility, who kneel at the feet of Mary, are Innocent Roman II and Eugenius Roman III, both vested in the pontifical mantle, but bareheaded. Originally, the mother and child alone had the nimbus around the head, as we see in a watercolor drawing from this original, now in the Barberini Library, dated 1640, made before a renovation by which that halo has been given alike to all the female figures. Another much faded mosaic, the Madonna and Child, under an arched canopy, high up on the campanile, may perhaps be as ancient as those on the façade. Medieval Christian art. The portico contains 2 frescoes of the Annunciation, one of them ascribed to Cavallini. Its walls are occupied by early Christian and pagan inscriptions. One of the time of Trajan is regarded with peculiar interest. Marcus Coxius lib. Aug. Ambrosius Prepositus, Vestis Albi, Triumphalis, Fecit, Nice conjugi sui cum qua vixit annos xxxxv. Debis xi, sine alla querella. Between the doors is preserved a curious relic, the stone, said to have been attached to Saint Calixtus when he was thrown into the well. The interior is that of a basilica. The nave, paved with opus Alexandrinum, is divided from the aisles by 22 ancient granite columns, whose Ionic capitals are in several instances decorated with heads of pagan gods. They support a richly decorated architrave. The roof, in the center of which is a picture of the Assumption of the Virgin, is painted by Domenichino. On the right of the entrance is a ciborium by Mino de Fisol. The high altar covers a confessional, beneath which are the remains of 5 early popes removed from the catacombs. Among the tombs are those of the painters, Lanfranco and Ciro Ferri, and of Bastari, librarian of the Vatican, editor of the Dictionary of the Della Cruscan Academy, and canon of this church, Ob 1775. Pope Innocent Roman II is buried here without a tomb. In the left transept is a beautiful Gothic tabernacle over an altar, erected by Cardinal de Lenken, nephew of Charles de Valois and brother of Philippe le Bel. On one side is the tomb of that cardinal. The fresco represents the martyrdom of his patron Saint Philip, who is portrayed as crucified with his head downwards like Saint Peter. On the other is the monument of Cardinal Stefanski, by Paolo, one of the first sculptors of the 14th century. Opening from hence is a chapel, which has a curious picture of the Council of Trent by Taddeo Zuccaro. At the end of the right aisle are several more fine tombs of the 16th century, and the chapel of the Madonna di Strada Cupa, designed by Domenichino, from whose hand is the figure of a child scattering flowers, sketched out in one corner of the vaulting. The upper part of the tribune is adorned with magnificent mosaics, restored in modern times by Camuccini, of the time of Innocent Roman II. In the center of the principal group on the vault is the Savior, seated with his mother, crowned and robed like an Eastern queen, beside him, both sharing the same gorgeous throne and footstool, while a hand extends from a fan-like glory with a jeweled crown held over his head. She a singular detail here, giving benediction with the usual action, he embracing her with the left arm, and in the right hand holding a tablet that displays the words, Veni, electa me, et panem in thronum meum, to which corresponds the text, from the Song of Solomon, on a tablet in her left hand. Lever ejus sub capite meo, et dextera Elias amplixabitur me. Below the heavenly throne stand, each with name inscribed in gold letters, Innocent Roman II, holding a model of this church, St. Lawrence in deacon's vestments with the Gospels and the jeweled cross, the sainted popes Calixtus I, Cornelius, and Julius I, St. Peter in classic white vestments, and Calipodius, a martyr of the 3rd century, here introduced because his body, together with those of the other saints in the same group, was brought from the catacombs to this church. As to ecclesiastical costume, this work affords decisive evidence of its ancient splendor and varieties. We do not see the keys in the hands of St. Peter, but the large tonsure on his head, that ecclesiastical badge which he is said to have invented and which is sometimes the sole peculiarity, besides the ever-recognizable type, given to this apostle in art. Above the archivolt we see a cross between the Alpha and Omega and the winged emblems of the evangelists. Laterally, Jeremiah and Isaiah, each with a prophetic text on a scroll. Along a frieze below, 12 sheep advancing from the holy cities, Jerusalem and Bethlehem, towards the divine Lamb, who stands on a mount whence issue the 4 rivers of paradise, or, according to perhaps juster interpretation, the 4 streams of gospel truth. Palms and a phoenix are seen beside the 2 prophets, also a less common symbol-caged birds, that signify the righteous soul incarcerated in the body, or, with highest reference, the Savior in his assumed humanity. Such accessory reminding of the ancient usage, in some countries, of releasing birds at funerals, and of that still kept up amidst the magnificent canonization rites, of offering various kinds of birds, in cages, at the papal throne. Remembering the date of the composition before us, about a century and a half before the time of Cimabue and Giotto, we may hail in it, if not an actual Renaissance, the dawn, at least, that heralds a brighter day for art, compared with the deep gloom previous. Hemans' medieval Christian art. Below these are another series of mosaics representing 6 scenes in the life of the Virgin, the work of Pietro Cavallani of the 13th century, when they were ordered by Bertoldo Stefanski, who is himself introduced in one of the subjects. In the center of the tribune is an ancient marble episcopal throne, raised by a flight of steps. In the sacristy is a picture of the Virgin with S. Rocco and S. Sebastiano by Perugino. Here are preserved some beautiful fragments of mosaics of birds, and C. from the catacombs. Outside the right transept of Sta. Maria is a picturesque shrine, and there are many points about this ancient church which are interesting to the artist. The palace, which forms one side of the piazza at the west end of the church, formerly Palazzo Marani, is now used as the summer residence of the Benedictine monks of S. Paolo, who are driven from their convent by the malaria during the hot months. During the revolutionary government of 1848-49, a number of priests suffered death here, which has led to the monastery being regarded as the Carmes of Rome. The modern church of S. Callisto contains the well in which he suffered martyrdom, AD 222. This well, now seen through a door near the altar, was then in the open air, and the Pope was thrown into it from the window of a house in which he had been imprisoned and scourged, and where he had converted the soldier who was appointed to guard him. His festival is celebrated here with great splendor by the monks. Opposite S. Callisto is the monastery of St. Anna, in which were passed the last days of the beautiful and learned Vittoria Colonna. As her death approached, she was removed to the neighboring house of her kinsman Giuliano Cesarini, and there she expired February 1547 in the presence of her devoted friend, Michelangelo, who always regretted that he had not in that solemn moment ventured to press his lips for the first and last time to her beautiful countenance. She was buried by her own desire in the convent chapel without any monument. Hence a lane leads to the church of S. Casimato, in an open space facing the hill of S. Ritro in Montorio, where stands of seats are placed during the Girandola. A courtyard is entered through a low arch supported by 2 ancient columns, having a high roof with rich terracotta moldings beautiful in color. The court contains an antique fountain and is exceedingly picturesque. The church has carefully sculptured details of cornice and molding. The door is a good specimen of medieval wood carving. The wall on the left of the altar is occupied by a most beautiful fresco of Pinturicchio, representing St. Francis and St. Clare standing on either side of the Virgin and Child. Opening from the end of the left aisle is a very interesting chapel, decorated with frescoes, and containing a most beautiful altar of the 15th century, in honor of the saints Severa and Fortunata, with statuettes of faith, justice, charity, and hope. Attached to the church is a very large convent of Poor Clares, which produced 2 saints, Theodora and Serafina, in the 15th century. Following the Via della Scala on the south side of Sta, Maria in Trastevere, we reach the Porta Setimiana, built by Alexander Roman VI. On the site of a gateway raised by Honorius, which marked the position of an arch of Septimius Severus. This is the entrance of the Via Lungara, containing the Corsini and Farnesina palaces, see chapter 20. The gateway has forked battlements, but is much spoilt by recent plasterings. Near this is Sta. Dorotea, an ugly church, but important in church history from its connection with the foundation of the Order of the Theatins, which arose out of a revulsion from the sensuous age of Leo X. And as containing the tomb of their founder, Don Gaetano di Titino, the friend of Paul Roman IV. Des la Rigne de Leon X, quelques symptômes d'une réaction religieuse manifesteront dans les hautes classes de la société romaine. On vit uncertain nombre de hommes éminents s'afflier les uns aux autres, afin de trouver dans de saints pratiques assez de force pour résister à l'atmosphère énervante qui les entourait. Ils prièrent pour leur association le titre et les embaumes de l'amour divin, et ils assassemblèrent, à des jours déterminés, dans l'église de Sainte Dorothée, prise de la Porte Setimiana. Parmi ces hommes de foyet d'avenir, on citate un archevêque, Carafa, un protégé apostolique, Gaëtan d'Athènes, un noble Vénitien aussi distingué par son caractère que par ses talents cantarini. Et 50 autres dont les noms rappellant tons, au une illustration au une haute position social, tels que l'Ipomano Sadalit Guiberti. Mais bientôt ces premiers essays de rupture avec la tendance générale, des esprits, enflammeront les îles de plusieurs des membres de la congrégation de l'amour divin. Carafa surtout, dont l'âme ardent en avait trouvé qu'anxiétés et fatigue dans les grandeurs, aspirate à une vie d'action qui lui permet de s'emplir, de tous ses moyens, à la réforme du monde. Il trouva dans Gaëtan d'Athènes des dispositions conformes à ce qu'il désirait. Gaëtan avait cependant un caractère très différent du sien, doué d'une angélique douceur, craignant de s'y faire entendre, recherchant la méditation et la retraite. Il out voulu, lui aussi, réformer le monde, mais il en out pas voulu en herder cano. Les qualités diverses de ces du hommes, rare s'y combinèrent heureusement, dans l'exécution du projet quils aviant concu, si aidate de former des ecclésiastiques voies, tout ensemble à la contemplation, et à une vie austère, à la prédication et aux soins des malades. Des ecclésiastiques qui donnassent part out au clergé à l'exemple de l'accomplissement des devoirs de sa sainte mission. Gurnery, Rome Creation, Roman II. When Dorothea, the maiden of Caesarea, was condemned to death by Sapricius, she replied, "Be it so, then I shall the sooner stand in the presence of Christ, my spouse, in whose garden are the fruits of paradise and roses that never fade." As she was being led to execution, the young Theophilus mocking said, "O maiden, goest thou to join thy bridegroom? Send me then, I pray thee, of the fruits and flowers which grow in his garden." And the maiden bowed her head and smiled, saying, "Thy request is granted, O Theophilus," whereat he laughed, and she went forward to death. And behold, at the place of execution, a beautiful child, with hair like the sunbeam, stood beside her, and in his hand was a basket containing 3 fresh roses and 3 apples. And she said, "Take these to Theophilus, and tell him that Dorothea waits for him in the garden from whence they came." And the child sought Theophilus, and gave him the flowers and the fruits, saying, "Dorothea sends thee these," and vanished. And the heart of Theophilus melted, and he ate of the fruit from heaven, and was converted and professed himself one of Christ's servants, so that he also was martyred, and was translated into the heavenly garden. Legend. This story is told in nearly all the pictures of Sta. Dorotea. Hence we reach the Pont Sisto, built 1473-75 by Sixtus Roman IV. In the place of the Pons Geniculensis, or, according to Ampere, the Pons Antoninus, which Caracalla had erected to reach the garden in the Trastevere, formerly belonging to his brother Getabut, which was known as the Pons Fractus, after a flood had destroyed part of it in 792. The Acts of Eusebius describe the many Christian martyrdoms which took place from this bridge. S. Symphorosa under Hadrian, S. Sabas under Aurelian, S. Calipodius under Alexander, and S. Anthemius under Diocletian were thrown into the Tiber from hence, with many others, whose bodies, usually drifting to the island then called Lycaonia, were recovered there by their faithful disciples. An inscription upon the bridge begs the prayers of the passengers for its papal founder. Beautiful views may be obtained from this bridge on the one side of the island of the Temple of Vesta and the Alban Hills, on the other of St. Peter's, rising behind the Farnesina Gardens, and the grand mass of the Farnese Palace, towering above the less important buildings. They had reached the bridge and stopped to look at the view, perhaps the most beautiful of all those seen from the Roman bridges. Looking towards the hills, the Tiber was spanned by Ponte Rado, under which the old black mills were turning ceaselessly, almost level with the tawny water. The sunshine fell full on the ruins of the Palatine, about the base of which had gathered a crowd of modern buildings. A brick campanile of the Middle Ages rose high above them against the blue sky, which was seen through its open arches. Beyond were the Latin hills. On the other hand, St. Peter's stood preeminent in the distance. Nearer, a stack of picturesque old houses were half hidden by orange trees, where golden fruit clustered thickly. Women leant from the windows, long lines of flapping clothes hung out to dry. Below, the ferry boat was crossing the river, impelled by the current. Modern and ancient Rome, all mingled together everywhere, were thrilling names connected with all that was most glorious in the past. The moderns are richer than their ancestors. The past is theirs as well as the present. Mademoiselle Maury. Close to the further entrance of the bridge, opposite the Via Giulia, is the Fountain of the Ponte Sisto, built by Paul V from a design of Fontana. The water, which falls in one body from a niche in the wall of a palace, is discharged a second time from the mouths of two monsters below. Chapter 18. The Tree Fontaine and S. Paolo. The Marmorata Arco di S. Lazzaro Protestant Cemetery Pyramid of Caius Cestius Monte de Stacioporta, S. Paolo Chapel of the Farewell the Tree Fontaine, SS. Vincenzo ed Anastasio sta. Maria Scala Celi S. Paolo alle Tree Fontaine, Basilica and Monastery of S. Paolo. Beyond the Piazza Bacca della Verita, the Via della Marmorata is spanned by an arch which nearly marks the site of the Porta Trigemina, by which Marius fled to Ostia before Sylla in BC 88. Near this stood the statue erected by public subscription to Minucius, whose jealousy brought about the execution of the patriot Malleus, BC 440. Here also was the temple of Jupiter Inventor, whose dedication was attributed to the gratitude of Hercules for the restoration of his cattle, carried off by Cacus to his cave on the neighboring Aventine. It was at the Porta Trigemina that Camillus, BC 391, sent into exile to Ardea by the accusations of the plebs, stayed, and, stretching forth his hands to the Capitol, prayed to the gods who reigned there that if he was unjustly expelled, Rome might one day have need of Camillus. Passing the arch, the road skirts the wooded escarpment of the Aventine, crowned by its three churches sta. Sabina, S. Alessio, and the Priorato. Desicate, intraele ventin et latiber, hors de la porte trigemina, etaint divers marchés, notamment le marché aux bois, le marché à la farine et au pain, les horia, magasins de blaze. Le voicinage de ces marchés, de ces magasins et de l'emporium, produisait un grand mouvement de transport, et fournissait de l'occupation à beaucoup de portefeuilles. Plot fait allusion à ces porteurs de sacs de la porte trigemina. On peut en voir encore tous les jours remplir le même office au même lieu, Ampere Hist, Rom, Roman 4, 75. From the landing place for modern Carrara marble, a new road on the right, planted with trees, leads along the river to the ancient Marmorata, discovered 1867-68, when many magnificent blocks of ancient marble were found buried in the mud of the Tiber. Recent excavations have laid bare the inclined planes by which the marbles were landed, and the projecting bars of stone with rings for mooring the marble vessels. In the neighboring vineyard are the massive ruins of the Emporium, or magazine for merchandise, founded by M. Aemilius Lepidus and L. Aemilius Paulus, the Aediles in BC 186. Upon the ancient walls of this time is engrafted a small and picturesque winepress of the 15th century. The neighboring vineyard is much frequented by marble collectors. A short distance beyond the turn to the Marmorata, the main road is crossed by an ancient brick arch, called Arco di S. Lazzaro or Arco della Salera, by the side of which is a hermitage. About half a mile beyond this, we reach the Porta S. Paolo, built by Belisarius on the site of the ancient Porta Ostiensis. It was here, just within the Ostian Gate, that the Emperor Claudius, returning from Ostia to take vengeance upon Messalina, was met by their two children, Octavia and Britannicus, accompanied by a Vestal, who insisted upon the rights of her order, and imperiously demanded that the empress should not be condemned undefended. Totila entra par la porte escenaria et unotter fois par la porte Oscensis, auderdhui porte Saint Paul, par la merm porte, genseric, quellamura portate, et qui nsm barquint avate dit a sun pilot, conduis moi vers la rivage que menace la colère divine. Ampere, Emp. Roman 2. 325. Close to this is the famous pyramid of Caius Cestius. It is built of brick, coated with marble, and is 125 feet high and 100 feet wide at its square basement. In the midst is a small sepulchral chamber, painted with arabesques. Two inscriptions on the exterior show that the Caius Cestius buried here was a praetor, a tribune of the people, and one of the epulones appointed to provide the sacrificial feasts of the gods. He died about 30 BC, leaving Agrippa as his executor, and desiring by his will that his body might be buried, wrapped up in precious stuffs. Agrippa, however, applied to him the law which forbade luxurious burial, and spent the money, partly upon the pyramid and partly upon erecting two colossal statues in honor of the deceased, of which the pedestals have been found near the tomb. In the Middle Ages, this was supposed to be the sepulchre of Remus. Set pyramide, sophless dimensions, est absolument semblable aux pyramides d'Egypte. Si l'on pouvait encore doubter que celles-ci étaient des tamo, l'imitation des pyramides égyptiennes dans un tamo ramen serait un argument de plus pour prouver qu'elles avaient une destination funéraire. La chambre qu'on a trouvée dans le monument de Cestius était décorée de peintures dont quelques unes n'y sont pas encore effacées. Si était la caudum des pupils anciens, notamment des Égyptiens et des Etrusques, de peindre l'intérieur des tamo, que l'on fermait en sut sognusment. Ces peintures, souvent très considérables, n'étaient que pour la mort, et n'y devaient jamais être vues par l'oeil d'un vivant. Il en était certainement ainsi de celles qui décorant la chambre sépulcrale de la pyramide de Cestius, car cette chambre en avait aucune entrée. L'ouverture par laquelle on y peinateur aujourd'hui est moderne. On avait dépassé le corps aux lescenders avant de terminer le monument, on écva en suit de la bâtir jusqu'au sommet. Ampere, Emp. I 347. St. Paul was led to execution beyond the city walls, upon the road to Ostia. As he issued forth from the gate, his eyes must have rested for a moment on that sepulchral pyramid which stood beside the road, and still stands unshattered, amid the wreck of so many centuries, upon the same spot. That spot was then only the burial place of a single Roman. It is now the burial place of many Britons. The mausoleum of Caius Cestius rises conspicuously amongst humbler graves, and marks the site where papal Rome suffers her Protestant sojourners to bury their dead. In England and in Germany, in Scandinavia and in America, there are hearts which turn to that lofty cenotaph as the sacred point of their whole horizon, even as the English villager turns to the grey church tower, which overlooks the gravestones of his kindred. Among the works of man, that pyramid is the only surviving witness of the martyrdom of St. Paul, and we may thus regard it with yet deeper interest, as a monument unconsciously erected by a pagan to the memory of a martyr. Nor let us think they who lie beneath its shadow are indeed resting, as degenerate Italians fancy, in unconsecrated ground. Rather let us say that a spot where the disciples of Paul's faith now sleep in Christ, so near the soil once watered by his blood, is doubly hallowed, and that their resting place is most fitly identified with the last earthly journey and the dying glance of their own patron saint, the apostle of the Gentiles, Caniber and Hausen. At the foot of the pyramid is the old Protestant cemetery, a lovely spot now closed. Here is the grave of Keats with the inscription. This grave contains all that was mortal of a young English poet, who, on his deathbed, in the bitterness of his heart at the malicious power of his enemies, desired these words to be engraven on his tombstone. Here lies one whose name was writ in water. February 24, 1821. Go thou to Rome at once the paradise, the grave, the city, and the wilderness, and where its wrecks like shattered mountains rise, and flowering weeds and fragrant copses dress the bones of desolation's nakedness, pass, till the spirit of the spot shall lead thy footsteps to a slope of green access. where, like an infant's smile, over the dead, a light of laughing flowers along the grass is spread. And gray walls moulder round, on which dull time feeds, like slow fire upon a hoary brand, and one keen pyramid with wedge sublime, pavilioning the dust of him who planned this refuge for his memory, doth stand like flame transformed to marble. And beneath a field is spread, on which a newer band have pitched in heaven's smile their camp of death, welcoming him we lose with scarce extinguished breath. Shelley's Adonais. Very near the grave of Keats is that of Augustus William Hare, the elder of the two brothers who wrote the Guesses at Truth, Ob 1834. When I am inclined to be serious, I love to wander up and down before the tomb of Caius Cestius. The Protestant burial ground is there, and most of the little monuments are erected to the young men of promise, cut off when on their travels full of enthusiasm, full of enjoyment. Brides, in the bloom of their beauty, on their first journey, or children born from home in search of health. This stone was placed by his fellow travelers, young as himself, who will return to the house of his parents without him, that by a husband or a father now in his native country. His heart is buried in that grave. It is a quiet and sheltered nook, covered in the winter with violets, and the pyramid that overshadows it gives it a classic and singularly solemn air. You feel an interest there, a sympathy you were not prepared for. You are yourself in a foreign land, and they are for the most part your countrymen. They call upon you in your mother tongue in English in words unknown to a native, known only to yourself, and the tomb of Cestius, that old majestic pile, has this also in common with them. It is itself a stranger among strangers. It has stood there till the language spoken round about it has changed, and the shepherd, born at the foot, can read the inscription no longer. Rogers. The new burial ground was opened in 1825. It extends for some distance along the slope of the hill under the old Aurelian wall, and is beautifully shaded by cypresses and carpeted with violets. Amid the forest of tombs, we may notice that which contains the heart of Shelley, his body having been burnt upon the shore at Larissae, where it was thrown up by the sea, inscribed. Percy Bysshe Shelley cor cordium, natus Roman 4, Aug. MDCCXI, obiit Roman 8, Jul. MDCCXI. Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Another noticeable tomb is that of Gibson the sculptor, who died 1868. From the fields in front of the cemetery, Prati del Popolo Romano, rises the Monte Testaccio, only 160 feet in height, but worth ascending for the sake of the splendid view it affords. The extraordinary formation of this hill, which is entirely composed of broken pieces of pottery, has long been an unexplained bewilderment. Le Monte Testaccio est, pour moi des nombreux problèmes, quoffrent les antiquités, romains le plus difficile à résoudre. On n'y put esseritor à discuter sérieusement la tradition d'après laquelle il aurait été formé, avec les débris des vases, contenant les tributs qu'apportaient à Rome les pupils soumis par elle. Cela évidemment une légende du moyen, et n'est du souvenir de la grandeur romaine, et imaginé, pour exprimer l'autre idée qu'on a sen facet, comme on avait imaginé sia statues de provinces placées au Capitole, et dont chacune portait, aucune cloche qui sonnait tout à coupe d'elle-même, quand une province s'y soulevait, comme on est prétendu quelle lit du tiberitate, pavé en par les tributs apportés, aux empereurs romans. Il faut donc chercher une autre explication. Ampere Emp. Roman 2, 386. Just outside the Porta S. Paolo is on the right a vineyard which belonged to Sta. Francesca Romana, born 1384, canonized 1608 by Paul V. Instead of entering into the pleasures to which her birth and riches entitled her Sta, Francesca went every day, disguised in a coarse woolen garment, to her vineyard and collected faggots, which she brought into the city on her head and distributed to the poor. If the weight exceeded her womanly strength, she loaded therewith an ass, following after on foot in great humility. Mrs. Jameson's Monastic Orders. A straight road a mile and a half long leads from the gate to the basilica. Halfway, on the left, is the humble chapel which commemorates the farewell of St. Peter and St. Paul on their way to martyrdom, inscribed. In this place, SS, Peter and Paul separated on their way to martyrdom. And Paul said to Peter, "Peace be with thee, foundation of the church, shepherd of the flock of Christ." And Peter said to Paul, "Go in peace, preacher of good tidings, and guide of the salvation of the just. Passing the basilica, which looks outside like a very ugly railway station, let us visit the scene of the martyrdom, before entering the grand church which arose in consequence. The road we now traverse is the scene of the legend of Plautilla. St. Paul was beheaded by the sword outside the Ostian Gate, about 2 miles from Rome, at a place called the Aqua Salvias, now the Tree Fontaine. The legend of his death relates that a certain Roman matron named Plautilla, one of the converts of St. Peter, placed herself on the road by which St. Paul passed to his martyrdom, to behold him for the last time, and when she saw him she wept greatly and besought his blessing. The apostle then, seeing her faith, turned to her and begged that she would give him her veil to blind his eyes when he should be beheaded, promising to return it to her after his death. The attendants mocked at such a promise, but Plautilla, with a woman's faith and charity, taking off her veil, presented it to him. After his martyrdom, St. Paul appeared to her and restored the veil stained with his blood. In the ancient representations of the martyrdom of St. Paul, the legend of Plautilla is seldom omitted. In the picture by Giotto in the sacristy of St. Peter's, Plautilla is seen on an eminence in the background, receiving the veil from the hands of St. Paul, who appears in the clouds above. The same representation, but little varied, is executed in bas-relief on the bronze doors of St. Peter's. Jameson's Sacred Art. The lane which leads to the Tree Fontaine turns off to the left a little beyond S. Paolo. In all the melancholy vicinity of Rome, there is not a more melancholy spot than the Tree Fontaine. A splendid monastery, rich with all the offerings of Christendom, once existed there. The ravages of that mysterious scourge of the Campagna, the malaria, have rendered it a desert. 3 ancient churches and some ruins still exist, and a few pale monks wander about the swampy, dismal confines of the hollow in which they stand. In winter you approach them through a quagmire. In summer you dare not breathe in their pestilential vicinity, and yet there is a sort of dead beauty about the place, something hallowed as well as sad, which seizes on the fancy. Jameson's Sacred Art. The convent was bestowed in 1867 by Pius Roman IX upon the French Trappists, and 12 brethren of the order went to reside there. Entering the little enclosure, the first church on the right is Sta. Maria Scala Coeli, supposed to occupy the site of the cemetery of S. Zeno, in which the 12,000 Christians employed in building the baths of Diocletian were buried. The present edifice was the work of Vignola and Giacomo della Porta in 1582. The name is derived from the legend that here St. Bernard had a vision of a ladder which led to heaven, its foot resting on this church, and of angels on the ladder leading upwards the souls whom his prayers had redeemed from purgatory. The mosaics in the apse were the work of F. Zucchero in the 16th century and are perhaps the best of modern mosaics. They represent the saints Zeno, Bernard, Vincenzo, and Anastasio, adored by Pope Clement Roman VIII, and Cardinal Aldobrandini, under whom the remodeling of the church took place. The second church is the Basilica of SS. Vincenzo ed Anastasio, founded by Honorius I 625 and restored by Honorius Roman III, 1221, when it was consecrated afresh. It is approached by an atrium with a penthouse roof, supported by low columns and adorned with decaying frescoes, among which the figure of Honorius Roman III may be made out. The interior, which reeks with damp, is almost entirely of the 12th century. The pillars are adorned with coarse frescoes of the apostles. S. Vincenz, Aletri, Fontaine so far deviates from the usual basilican arrangement as almost to deserve the appellation of Gothic. It has the same defect as all the rest, its pier arches being too low, for which there is no excuse here. But both internally and externally, it shows a uniformity of design, and a desire to make every part ornamental. That produces a very pleasing effect, although the whole is merely of brick, and ornament is so sparingly applied as only just to prevent the building sinking to the class of mere utilitarian erections. Ferguson's Handbook of Architecture, Volume Roman II. The 2 saints whose relics are said to repose here were in no wise connected in their lifetime. S. Vincenz, who suffered AD 304, was a native of Saragossa, cruelly tortured to death at Valencia under Dacian by being racked on a slow fire over a gridiron, of which the bars were framed like scythes. His story is told with horrible detail by Prudentius. Anastasius, who died AD 628, was a native of Persia, who had become a Christian and taken the monastic habit at a convent near Jerusalem. He was tortured and finally strangled, under Chosroes, at Barcelona, in Assyria. He is not known to be represented anywhere in art, save in the almost obliterated frescoes in the atrium of this church. The third church, S. Paolo alle Tre Fontane, was built by Giacomo della Porta for Cardinal Aldobrandini in 1590. It contains the pillars to which St. Paul is said to have been bound, the block of marble upon which he is supposed to have been beheaded, and the 3 fountains which sprang forth, wherever the severed head struck the earth during 3 bounds which it made after decapitation. In proof of this story, it is asserted that the water of the first of these fountains is still warm, of the second tepid, of the third cold. 3 modern altars above the fountains are each decorated with a head of the apostle in bas-relief. À la première, elle aime vint à l'instant même de sa chepper du corps. Si chef gloria est plein de vie. À la seconde, les ombres de la mort couvent déjà ses admirables traits. À la troisième, le somme l'éternel les envahes et, quoique demures tout rayonnants de beauté, ils descent, sans parler, que dans si monde ces levers ni s'entr'ouvrent plus, et que si regard d'égal est volé pour taugers. Une création à Rome. The pavement is an ancient mosaic representing the 4 seasons, brought from the excavations at Ostia. The interior of this church has been beautified at the expense of a French nobleman, and the whole enclosure of the Tre Fontane has been improved by Mgr. de Merode. As the martyr and his executioners passed on, from the Ostian Gate, their way was crowded with a motley multitude of goers and comers between the metropolis and its harbor merchants hastening to superintend the unlading of their cargo sailors eager to squander the profits of their last voyage in the dissipations of the capital officials of the government charged with the administration of the provinces, or the command of the legions on the Euphrates, or the Rhine Chaldean astrologers Phrygian eunuchs dancing girls from Syria, with their painted turbans mendicant priests from Egypt, howling for Osiris Greek adventurers, eager to coin their national cunning into Roman gold representatives of the avarice and ambition, the fraud and lust, the superstition and intelligence of the imperial world. Through the dust and tumult of that busy throng, the small troop of soldiers threaded their way silently, under the bright sky of an Italian midsummer. They were marching, though they knew it not, in a procession more really triumphal than any they had ever followed, in the train of general or emperor, along the sacred way. Their prisoner, now at last and forever delivered from captivity, rejoiced to follow his lord without the gate. The place of execution was not far distant, and there the sword of the headsman ended his long course of sufferings and released that heroic soul from that feeble body. Weeping friends took up his corpse and carried it for burial to those subterranean labyrinths, where, through many ages of oppression, the persecuted church found refuge for the living and sepulchres for the dead. Thus died the apostle, the prophet, and the martyr, bequeathing to the church in her government and her discipline the legacy of his apostolic labors, leaving his prophetic words to be her living oracles, pouring forth his blood to be the seed of 1,000 martyrdoms. Thenceforth, among the glorious company of the apostles, among the goodly fellowship of the prophets, among the noble army of martyrs, his name has stood preeminent. And wheresoever the Holy Church throughout all the world doth acknowledge God, there Paul of Tarsus is revered, as the great teacher of a universal redemption and a Catholic religion, the herald of glad tidings to all mankind. Caniber and Hausen. Let us now return to the grand basilica, which arose to commemorate the martyrdom on this desolate site, and which is now itself standing alone on the edge of the Campagna, entirely deserted except by a few monks who linger in its monastery through the winter months. But take flight to St. Callisto. Before the pestilential malaria of the summer, though, in the Middle Ages, it was not so, when S. Paolo was surrounded by the flourishing fortified suburb of Jonopolis, so called from its founder, John Roman VIII, whose possession was sharply contested in the wars between the popes and anti-popes. The first church on the site was built in the time of Constantine, on the site of the vineyard of the Roman matron Lucina, where she first gave a burial place to the apostle. This primal oratory was enlarged into a basilica in 386 by the emperors Valentinian Roman II and Theodosius. The church was restored by Leo Roman III, 795–816, and every succeeding century increased its beauty and magnificence. The sovereigns of England, before the Reformation, were protectors of this basilica as those of France are of St. John Lateran and of Spain of Sta. Maria Magurand, the emblem of the Order of the Garter, may still be seen amongst its decorations. The very abandonment of this huge pile, standing in solitary grandeur on the banks of the Tiber, was one source of its value. While it had been kept in perfect repair, little or nothing had been done to modernize it and alter its primitive form and ornaments, excepting the later addition of some modern chapels above the transept. It stood naked and almost rude, but unencumbered with the lumpish and tasteless plaster encasement of the old basilica in a modern Berninesque church, which had disfigured the Lateran cathedral under pretense of supporting it. It remained genuine, though bare, as S. Apollinaire in class, at Ravenna, the city eminently of unspoiled basilicas. No chapels, altars, or mural monuments softened the severity of its out-asterisk lines, only the series of papal portraits, running round the upper line of the walls, redeemed this sternness. But the unbroken files of columns along each side carried the eye forward to the great central object, the altar and its confession, while the secondary row of pillars, running behind the principal ones, gave depth and shadow, mass and solidity to back up the noble avenue along which one glanced. Cardinal Weissmann. On the 15th of July, 1823, this magnificent basilica was almost totally destroyed by fire, on the night which preceded the death of Pope Pius VII. Quelque chose de mystérieux est lié dans l'esprit des Romains à l'incendie de Saint Paul, et les gens à l'imagination de si pupil parlant, avec si sombre plaisir qui tient à la mélancolie, si sentiment si rare en Italie, et si fréquent en Allemagne. Dans la grande nef, sur le mur, au-dessus des colonnes, s'y trouvait la longue suite des portraits de tous les papes, et le pupil de Rome voyait avec inquiétude qu'il n'y avait plus de place pour le portrait du successeur de Pi Roman VII. De là les fruits de la suppression du Saint-Siège. Le vénérable pontife, qui était presque un martyr aux yeux de ses sujets, touchait à ses derniers moments lorsque reva l'incendie de Saint Paul. Il y eut dans la nuit du 16 juillet 1823, cette même nuit, le pape presque mourant, fut agité par un songe, qui lui présentait sans cesse un grand malheur arrivé à l'église de Rome. Il essayait en sursaut plusieurs fois, et demanda s'il en était rien arrivé de nouveau. Le lendemain, pour ne pas aggraver son état en lui cacha l'incendie, et il est mort après sans l'avoir jamais su. Stendhal, Roman II. 94. Not a word was said to the dying Pius Roman VII of the destruction of St. Paul, for at St. Paul's he had lived as a quiet monk, engaged in study and in teaching, and he loved the place with the force of an early attachment. It would have added a mental pang to his bodily sufferings to learn the total destruction of that venerable sanctuary, in which he had drawn down by prayer the blessings of heaven on his youthful labor. Weissmann, Life of Pius Roman VII. The restoration of the basilica was immediately begun, and a large contribution levied for the purpose from all Roman Catholic countries. In 1854, it was reopened in its present form by Pius Roman IX. Its exterior is below contempt. Its interior, supported by 80 granite columns, is most striking and magnificent, but it is cold and uninteresting when compared with the ancient structure. Rich with inestimable remains of ancient art and venerable from 1,000 associations. If we approach the basilica by the door on the side of the monastery, we enter, first, a portico containing a fine statue of Gregory Roman XVI, and many fragments of the ancient mosaics collected after the fire, then a series of small chapels which were not burnt, from the last of which ladies can look into the beautiful cloister of the 12th century, which they are not permitted to enter, but which men may visit through the sacristy, and inspect its various architectural remains and a fine sarcophagus, adorned with reliefs of the story of Apollo and Marsyas. The church is entered by the south end of the transept. Hence we look down upon the nave, 306 feet long and 222 wide, with its 4 ranges of granite columns, quarried near the Lago Maggiore, surmounted by a mosaic series of portraits of the popes, each 5 feet in diameter, most of them of course being imaginary. The grand triumphal arch which separates the transept from the nave is a relic of the old basilica, and was built by Galla Placidia, sister of Honorius, in 440. On the side towards the nave, it is adorned with a mosaic of Christ adored by the 24 elders, and the 4 beasts of the Revelation, on that towards the transept by the figure of the Savior, between St. Peter and St. Paul. It bears 2 inscriptions, the first, Theodosius coepit, professit honorius olim doctoris mundi sacratam corpor Pauli. The other, especially interesting as the only inscription commemorating the great pope who defended Rome against Attila. Placidii pia mens operis decus homini, sic, paterni gaudet pontificis studio splendor Leonis. The mosaics of the tribune, also preserved from the fire, were designed by Cavallini, a pupil of Giotto, in the 13th century, and were erected by Honorius Roman III. They represent the Savior with St. Peter and St. Andrew on the right, and St. Paul and St. Luke on the left, and beneath these 12 apostles and 2 angels. The holy innocents, supposed to be buried in this church, are represented lying at the feet of our Savior. In the mosaics of the old Basilica of S. Paolo, the holy innocents were represented by a group of small figures holding palms, and placed immediately beneath the altar or throne, sustaining the gospel, the cross, and the instruments of the Passion of our Lord. Over these figures was the inscription, H.I.S. Innocents, Jameson's Sacred Art. Beneath the triumphal arch stands the ugly modern baldacchino, which encloses the ancient altar canopy, erected, as its inscription tells us, by Arnulfus and his pupil Petrus in 1285. In front is the Confession, where the Apostle of the Gentiles is believed to repose. The baldacchino is inscribed, Tu es vas electionis, Sanct Paul Apostol, Predicator Veritatis in Universo Mundo. It is supported by 4 pillars of oriental alabaster, presented by Mehemet Ali, Pasha of Egypt. The altars of malachite at the ends of the transepts were given by the Emperor Nicholas of Russia. Les schismatiques et les musulmans humermes sont venus render homage à si souverain de la parole, qui entraînait les pupils au martyr et subjuguait toutes les nations. Une création à Rome. In a building so entirely modern, there are naturally few individual objects of interest. Among those saved from the old basilica is the magnificent Paschal candlestick, covered with sculpture in high relief. The altar at the south end of the transept has an altarpiece representing the Assumption, by Agricola, and statues of Saint Benedict, Bani, and Sta. Scholastica, by Tenerani. Of the 2 chapels between this and the tribune, the first has a statue of Saint Benedict by Tenerani. The second, the Cappella del Coro, was saved from the fire, and is by Carlo Maderno. The altar at the north end of the transept is dedicated to St. Paul, and has a picture of his conversion by Camuccini. At the sides are statues of Saint Gregory by Laboureur and of S. Romualdo by Stockai. Of the chapels between this and the tribune, the first, dedicated to Saint Stephen, has a statue of the saint by Rinaldi. The second is dedicated to Saint Bridget, Brigida Brach, and contains the famous crucifix of Pietro Cavallini, which is said to have spoken to her in 1370. Not far from the chancel is a beautiful chapel, dedicated to Saint Bridget and ornamented with her statue in marble. During her residence in Rome, she frequently came to pray in this church, and here is preserved, as a holy relic, the cross from which, during her ecstatic devotion, she seemed to hear a voice proceeding. Frederica Bremer. The upper walls of the nave are decorated with frescoes by Gagliardi, Podesti, and other modern artists. The 2 great festivals of St. Paul are solemnly observed in this basilica upon January 25 and June 30, and that of the Holy Innocents upon December 28. Very near S. Paolo, the main branch of the little river Almo, the Cursuc Brevissimus Almo of Ovid, falls into the Tiber. This is the spot where the priests of Cybele used to wash her statue and the sacred vessels of her temple, and to raise their loud annual lamentation for the death of her lover, the shepherd Aedes. Es locus, in Tibrim quo lubricus influit Almo, et nomen magno perdit ab amni minor, illic purpurea canis cum vest sacerdos, almonis dominam sacrac lavit aquis. Ovid Fast, Roman 4, 337. Phrygique matris almo qua levet ferrum. Martial Ep, Roman 3, 472. Un via praetor de Cybele, verdu de porper, lavit chac anela pir sacre de pessinant, tandis qua daughters praetors pauciant des hurlments, Frappiant sur le timbre de basque quan place aux mains de Cybele, soufflant avec fureur dans les flûtes phrygiens, et que elan si donnait la discipline, ni plus ni moins quan le fait encore, dans l'église des cervait avec des fouets garnis de petits cailloux docilits. Ampere, Hist. Rom. Roman 3, 145. The Campagna on this side of Rome is perhaps more stricken by malaria than any other part, and is in consequence more utterly deserted. That this terrible scourge has followed upon the destruction of the villas and gardens which once filled the suburbs of Rome, and that it did not always exist here, is evident from the account of Pliny, who says, "Such is the happy and beautiful amenity of the Campagna, that it seems to be the work of a rejoicing nature." For truly so it appears in the vital and perennial salubrity of its atmosphere vitalis ac perennis salubritatis celi temporis, in its fertile plains, sunny hills, healthy woods, thick groves, rich varieties of trees, breezy mountains, fertility in fruits, vines, and olives, its noble flocks of sheep, abundant herds of cattle, numerous lakes, and wealth of rivers and streams pouring in upon its many seaports, in whose lap the commerce of the world lies, and which run largely into the sea as it were to help mortals. Under the emperors, the town of Ostia, founded by Ancus Martius, reached such a degree of prosperity that its suburbs are described as joining those of Rome, so that one magnificent street almost united the two. There is now, beyond S. Paulo, a road through a desert, only one human habitation breaking the utter solitude. Chapter 19. The Villas Borghese, Madama, and Melani. Protestant Church's Villa, Borghese Raphael's Villa Casino, and Villa of Papa Giulio, Claude's Villa Arcooscuro Quasitosa Chapel of St. Andrew Pont Mall, Castle of Crescenza Prima Porta the Crimer the Alia, the Via Cascia Villa Madama Monti, Mario Villa Melini Porta Angelica. Immediately outside the Porta del Popolo, on the left, are the English and American churches. As to the position selected for these buildings, it is to be observed that, although restricted by the regulations of the Roman Catholic hierarchy to a locality outside the walls, the greatest possible attention has been paid to the convenience of the English, the great majority of whose dwelling houses are in this immediate quarter. The English church in Rome, therefore, though nominally outside the walls, is really, as regards centrality, in the very heart of the city. The greatest possible facilities are afforded by the authorities to our countrymen in all matters relating to the establishment. And though the general behavior of the Roman inhabitants is such as to render the precaution almost unnecessary, the protection of the police and military is invariably afforded during the hours of divine service. Whatever be the disagreements on points of religious faith between Protestant and Catholic, there is at least one point of feeling in common between both in this respect. For the streets are tranquil, the shops are shut, the demeanor of the people is decent and orderly, and notwithstanding the distance from England, Sunday feels more like a Sunday at Rome than in any other town in Europe. Sir G. Head's Tour in Rome. The papal government of Rome had more tolerance for a religion which was not its own than that of the early emperors. Augustus refused to allow the performance of Egyptian rites within a mile of the city walls. On the right of the gate is the handsome entrance of the beautiful Villa Borghese, most liberally thrown open to the public on every day except Monday, when the Villa Doria is open. The entrance to the Villa Borghese is just outside the Porta del Popolo. Passing beneath that not very impressive specimen of Michelangelo's architecture, a minute's walk will transport the visitor from the small, uneasy lava stones of the Roman pavement into broad, graveled carriage drives, whence a little further stroll brings him to the soft turf of a beautiful seclusion. A seclusion, but seldom a solitude. For priest, noble, and populace, stranger and native, all who breathe the Roman air, find free admission, and come hither to taste the languid enjoyment of the daydream which they call life. The scenery is such as arrays itself to the imagination when we read the beautiful old myths, and fancy a brighter sky, a softer turf, a more picturesque arrangement of venerable trees, than we find in the rude and untrained landscapes of the Western world. The ilex trees, so ancient and time-honored are they, seem to have lived for ages undisturbed, and to feel no dread of profanation by the axe any more than overthrow by the thunderstroke. It has already passed out of their dreamy old memories that only a few years ago they were grievously imperiled by the Gauls' last assault upon the walls of Rome. As if confident in the long peace of their lifetime, they assume attitudes of evident repose. They lean over the green turf in ponderous grace, throwing abroad their great branches without danger of interfering with other trees, though other majestic trees grow near enough for dignified society, but too distant for constraint. Never was there a more venerable quietude than that which sleeps among their sheltering boughs, never a sweeter sunshine than that which gladdens the gentle bloom which these leafy patriarchs strive to diffuse over the swelling and subsiding lawns. In other portions of the grounds, the stone pines lift their dense clumps of branches upon a slender length of stem, so high that they look like green islands in the air, flinging down a shadow upon the turf so far off that you scarcely know which tree has made it. Again, there are avenues of cypress, resembling dark flames of huge funeral candles, which spread dusk and twilight round about them instead of cheerful radiance. The more open spots are all a-bloom early in the season, with anemones of wondrous size, both white and rose-colored, and violets that betray themselves by their rich fragrance, even if their blue eyes fail to meet your own. Daisies, too, are abundant, but larger than the modest little English flower, and therefore of small account. These wooded and flowery lawns are more beautiful than the finest English park scenery, more touching, more impressive, through the neglect that leaves nature so much to her own ways and methods. Since man seldom interferes with her, she sets to work in her quiet way and makes herself at home. There is enough of human care, it is true, bestowed long ago and still bestowed, to prevent wildness from growing into deformity, and the result is an ideal landscape, a woodland scene that seems to have been projected out of the poet's mind. If the ancient faun were other than a mere creation of old poetry and could reappear anywhere, it must be in such a scene as this. In the openings of the wood there are fountains plashing into marble basins, the depths of which are shaggy with waterweeds, or they tumble like natural cascades from rock to rock, sending their murmur afar to make the quiet and silence more appreciable. Scattered here and there with careless artifice stand old altars bearing Roman inscriptions. Statues, gray with the long corrosion of even that soft atmosphere, half hide and half reveal themselves, high on pedestals or perhaps fallen and broken on the turf. Terminal figures, columns of marble or granite porticos and arches, are seen in the vistas of the wood paths, either veritable relics of antiquity, or with so exquisite a touch of artful ruin on them that they are better than if really antique. At all events, grass grows on the tops of the shattered pillars, and weeds and flowers root themselves in the chinks of the massive arches and fronts of temples, as if this were the 1000th summer since their winged seeds alighted there. What a strange idea, what a needless labor to construct artificial ruins in Rome, the native soil of ruin. But even these sportive imitations, wrought by man in emulation of what time has done to temples and palaces, are perhaps centuries old, and, beginning as illusions, have grown to be venerable in sober earnest. The result of all is a scene, such as is to be found nowhere save in these princely villa residences in the neighborhood of Rome. A scene that must have required generations and ages, during which growth, decay, and man's intelligence wrought kindly together, to render it so gently wild as we behold it now. The final charm is bestowed by the malaria. There is a piercing, thrilling, delicious kind of regret in the idea of so much beauty being thrown away, or only enjoyable at its half-development, in winter and early spring, and never to be dwelt amongst, as the home scenery of any human being. For if you come hither in summer, and stray through these glades in the golden sunset, fever walks arm in arm with you, and death awaits you at the end of the dim vista. Thus the scene is like Eden in its loveliness, like Eden, too, in the fatal spell that removes it beyond the scope of man's actual possessions. Transformation. Oswald et Corinne terminarent leur voyage de Rome par la Villa Borghese, celui de tous les jardins, et de tous les palais romains, où les splendeurs de la nature et des arts sont ressemblées avec le plus de gaut et d'éclat. On y voit des arbres de toutes les espèces et des eaux magnifiques. Une réunion incroyable de statues, de vases, de sarcophages antiques, si merlant avec la fraîcheur de la jeune nature du sud. La mythologie des anciens y semble renommée. Les naïades sont placées sur le bord des ans, les nymphs dans les bois dins d'elles, les tombeaux sous les ombrages elyssines, les statues d'Esculape est au milieu d'une île. Celle de Vénus semble sortir des ans. Ovid et Virgil pourrient s'y promener dans si beau lieu, et s'y croire encore au cycle d'Auguste. Les chefs d'œuvre de sculpture qui renferment le palais, lui donnent une magnificence et jamais nouvelle. En apercoit de loin à travers les arbres, la ville de Rome et Saint-Pierre, et la campagne, et les longues arcades, débris des aqueducs qui transportient les sources des montagnes dans l'ancienne Rome. Tout est là pour la pensée, pour l'imagination, pour la rêverie. Les sensations les plus pures s'y confondent avec les plaisirs de l'âme, et donnent l'idée d'un bonheur parfait. Mais quand on demande, pourquoi si séjour ravissant n'est-il pas habité? Elle vous répond que le mauvais air, la cattiva aria, ni permit pas d'y vivre pendant l'été. Madame de Staël. The casino, at the further end of the villa, built by Cardinal Scipio Borghese, the favorite nephew of Paul V, contains a collection of sculpture. The first room entered is a great hall, with a ceiling painted by Mario Rossi, and a floor paved with an ancient mosaic discovered at the Torre Nuova, one of the principal Borghese farms, in 1835. Cet mosaic fort curieux nous offre at les combats des gladiateurs, intrayou et leurs luttes avec les animaux féroces. Cet mosaic est d'un dessin aussi barbare que les scenes représentées. Tout est en harmonie, le sujet et le tableau. Le sentiment de répulsion qu'inspire la cruauté romaine en est que plus complète. Celle-ci en est point adoucie par l'art et par it dans tout salé dur. On voit les gladiateurs poursuivre et s'attaquer, si massacrer couverts d'armures qui ressemblent à celles des chevaliers. Vous diriez une odieuse parodie du Moyen Âge. Dans le corps de l'un des combattants anglais est enfoncé. Des cadavres sont gisant parmi les flaques de sang. À côté du est le theta fatal, initial du mot grec theta letter 1F01 nu alpha tau omicron sigma laquelle leur jugem pitiable, le pupil, les condamnés. Du grec part out. Le maître excite ses élèves en leur montrant la fouet et la pomme, les vainqueurs élevant leurs épées et sans doubt la foule applaudit. Ils ont un air de triomphe. Si sont des acteurs renommés. Opers de chacun son nomest écrit, ces noms barbares ou étranges, l'un s'appelle Bucebus, un autre Cupidor, un autre Licentiosus, avis effrontés aux dames Romans. Ampere Roman 4, 31. The collection in this villa contains no exceedingly important statues. In the vestibule are some reliefs from the Arch of Claudius and the Corso, destroyed in 1527. Leaving the Great Hall to the left, we may notice. First room. In the center, Juno Pernuba from Monte Calvi. Second room. In the center, a fighting Amazon on horseback. Third room, Daphne changed into a laurel, Anacreon seated. La statue d'Anacreon est très remarquable. Elle ressemble à la figure du poète sur une médaille de Théos. Le style est simple et grandiose, l'expression énergique plutôt que gracieuse, la draperie est rude, la statue respire l'enthousiasme. Si en est pas le faux Anacreon que nous connaissons et dont les pièces sont postérieures aux moins en grande partie à la date du véritable. C'est le vil et primitif Anacreon. Cet Anacreon la ni vit plus que dans cet énergique portrait, sur image de son inspiration véritable, dont les produits authentiques ont presque entièrement disparu. Ampere, Hist. Rome, Roman 3, 567. Fourth room. A handsome gallery with paintings by Marchetti and De Angelis, adorned with porphyry busts of the 12 Caesars. Bronze statue of a boy. Sixth room. In the center, a Greek poet, probably Alcaeus, the hermaphrodite found near Sta, Maria Vittoria. Seventh room. In the center, boy on a dolphin. Daughter's statues puvent deriver de la grande composition maritime de Scopas. Tel est la Paliman, assis sur un dauphin, de la Villa Borghese, d'après lequel a été évidement conque le Jonas de l'église de Sainte-Marie du Pupil, quan attribue à Raphael. Ampere, Hist. Rome, Roman 3, 284. Eighth room, dancing satyr. The upper story, reached by a winding staircase from the Galleria, contains first room 3 fine works by Bernini. David with the sling, executed in his 18th year. Apollo and Daphne. Aeneas carrying off Anchises, executed when the sculptor was only 15 years old. Second room. Filled with a collection of portraits, for the most part unknown. Worthy of attention are the portraits of Paul V by Caravaggio, and of his father Marcantonio Borghese, attributed to Guido, also the busts of Paul V and of Cardinal Scipio Borghese, who built the villa by Bernini. Fifth room. Statue of Princess Pauline Borghese, sister of Napoleon I, by Canova as Venus Victrix. Canova esteemed his statue of the Princess Borghese as one of his best works. No one else could have an opportunity of judging of it, for the prince, who certainly was not jealous of his wife's person, was so jealous of her statue that he kept it locked up in a room in the Borghese palace, of which he kept the key, and not a human being, not even Canova himself, could get access to it. Eaton's Rome. Canova took Chantry to see this statue by night, wishing, as was his wont, to show it by the light of a single taper. Chantry, wishing to do honor to the artist, insisted upon holding the taper for the best light himself, which gave rise to Moore's lines. When he, thy peer in art and fame, hung o'er the marble with delight, and while his lingering hand would steal o'er every grace the taper's rays, gave thee, with all the generous zeal such master spirits only feel, the best of fama rivals praise. In the upper part of the grounds, not far from the walls of Rome, stood the Villa Algiati, once the Villa of Raphael. It contained 3 rooms ornamented with frescoes from the hand of the great master. The best of these are now preserved in a room at the end of the gallery in the Borghese Palace. The villa was destroyed during the siege of Rome in 1849, when many of the fine old trees were cut down on this side of the grounds. The Casino of Raphael was unfurnished, except with casks of wine, and uninhabited, except by a contadina. The chamber which was the bedroom of Raphael was entirely adorned with the work of his own hands. It was a small, pleasant apartment, looking out on a little green lawn, fenced in with trees irregularly planted. The walls were covered with arabesques, in various whimsical and beautiful designs such as the sports of children, loves balancing themselves on poles or mounted on horseback, full of glee and mirth, fawns and satyrs, Mercury and Minerva, flowers and curling tendrils, and every beautiful composition that could suggest itself to a classic imagination in its most sportive mood. The cornice was supported by painted caryatides. The coved roof was adorned with 4 medallions, containing portraits of his mistress. The Fornarina, it seemed as if he took pleasure in multiplying that beloved object, so that wherever his eyes turned her image might meet them. There were 3 other paintings, one representing a terminus with a target before it, and a troop of men shooting at it with bows and arrows which they had stolen from unsuspecting Cupid, lying asleep on the ground. The second represented a figure, apparently a god, seated at the foot of a couch, with an altar before him in a temple or rotunda, and from the gardens which appeared in perspective through its open intercolumniations, were seen advancing a troop of gay young nymphs, bearing vases full of roses upon their heads. The last and best of these paintings represented the nuptials of Alexander the Great and Roxana. Eaton's Rome. Just outside the Porta del Popolo, a small gate on the left of the Villa Borghese leads to the Villa Esmead, the property of an Englishman of considerable extent and possessing beautiful views of Rome and the Sabine Mountains from its heights, which are adorned with a few ancient statues and vases. Unpleasantly situated near the gate of the Villa Borghese is the pig market. Fortunately, the manner of pig killing at Rome is not so noisy as that in northern countries. The throats of the animals are not cut, but they are pierced under the left shoulder with a long pointed bodkin, which kills them almost instantly, no blood flowing. In a very few minutes, a whole penful of pigs can be stilettoed in this manner indeed. For anyone interested in farming matters, the slaughter of the Roman pigs is a sight worth seeing. We now enter upon the ugly dusty road, which leads in a straight line to the Milvian Bridge. By this road, the last triumphal procession entered Rome, that of the Emperor Honorius and Stilicho, described by the poet Claudian, in AD 403, a whole century having then elapsed since the Romans had beheld their last triumph, that of Diocletian. Under the line of hills, Monte Perioli, on the right of the road are the catacombs of St. Valentine. On the other side, the same hills are undermined by the catacombs of SS, Genudis, and Basila. Half a mile from the gate rises conspicuously on the right of the road the Casino of Papa Giulio, with picturesque overhanging cornices and sculptured fountain. The courtyard has a quaint cloister. This is the Velino, And, far behind, but formerly connected with it by a long corridor, is the villa of Papa Giulio, containing several rooms with very richly decorated ceilings, painted by Taddeo Zuccaro. Michelangelo was consulted by the Pope as to the building of this villa, and Vasari made drawings for it, but the actual architect was Vignola, a modest genius who had to suffer severely, together with all his fellow workmen, from the tracasseries of the Pope's favorite, the Bishop Aliotti, whom the less enduring Michelangelo was wont to nickname Monsignor Tontcos. The villa of Papa Giulio is still visited by the stranger. Restored to the presence of those times, he ascends the spacious steps to the gallery, whence he overlooks the whole extent of Rome, from Monte Mario, with all the windings of the Tiber. The building of this palace, the laying out of its gardens, were the daily occupation of Pope Julius Roman III. The place was designed by himself, but was never completed. Every day brought with it some new suggestion or caprice, which the architects must at once set themselves to realize. This pontiff desired to forward the interests of his family, but he was not inclined to involve himself in dangerous perplexities on their account. The pleasant, blameless life of his villa was that which was best suited to him. He gave entertainments, which he enlivened with proverbial and other modes of expression that sometimes mingled blushes with the smiles of his guests. In the important affairs of the church and state, he took no other share than was absolutely inevitable. This Pope Julius died March 23, 1555. Ranks Hist. Of the popes. Se uniquement comme predictor des arts et comme prince magnifique, quenus pouvons envisager Jules Roman III. Sa mauvaise santé lui faisait rechercher le repos, et les douceurs d'une vie grande et libre. Aussi avait-il fait édifier, avec une sorte de tendresse paternelle, cette belle villa, qui est célèbre, dans l'histoire de l'art, sous le nom divin de Pape Jules. Michel-Ange, Vasari, Vignola and Avient dessiné les profils, les nymphes et les fontaines étaient demonati, les peintures de Taddeo Zuccari. Du haut d'une galerie élégante en découvrait les sept collines, et d'embresses allées, tracées par Jules Roman III. Égarient les paduvis à dans d'adel de terters et de valets qui séparent le pont ou paret maxence de la ville éternelle. Gurnery, Rome Creation, Roman II. 172. Pope Julius used to come hither with all his court, from the Vatican by water. The richly decorated barge, filled with venerable ecclesiastics, gliding between the osier-fringed banks of the yellow Tiber, with its distant line of churches and palaces, would make a fine subject for a picture. Nearly opposite the Casino Papa Giulio, on the further bank of the Tiber, is the picturesque classic villa of Claude Lorraine, whither he was wont to retire during the summer months, residing in the winter in the Tempietto at the head of the Trinitas steps. This villa is best seen from the walk by the riverside, which is reached by turning at once to the left on coming out of the Porta del Popolo. Hence, it makes a good foreground to the view of the city and distant heights of the Janiculum. This road is called Poussin's Walk, because the great painter used to go along it from Rome to his villa near Pont Mall. One sees here an horizon such as one often finds in Poussin's pictures. Frederica Bremer. Close to the Villa Papa Giulio is the tunnel called Arco Oscuro, passing which, a steep lane with a beautiful view towards St. Peter's, ascends between the hillsides of the Monte Pariani and descends on the other side, following the turn to the right to the Tiber bank, about 2 miles from Rome, where is situated the Aqua Acetosa, a refreshing mineral spring like seltzer water, enclosed in a fountain erected by Bernini for Alexander Roman VII. There is a lovely view from hence across the Campagna in the direction of Fidene, Castel Giubileo, and the Torre di Quinto. A green hill, one of those bare tablelands so common in the Campagna, rises on the right. Ascend it to where a broad furrow in the slope seems to mark the site of an ancient road. You are on a plateau, almost quadrangular in form, rising steeply to the height of nearly 200 feet above the Tiber, and isolated, save at one angle, where it is united to other high ground by a narrow isthmus. Not a tree knot, a shrub on its turf-grown surface not, a house not, a ruin not one stone upon another, to tell you that the site had been inhabited. Yet here once stood Antimone, the city of many towers, one of the most ancient of Italy. Not a trace remains above ground. Even the broken pottery, that infallible indicator of bygone civilization, which marks the site and determines the limits of habitation on many a now desolate spot of classic ground, is here so overgrown with herbage that the eye of an antiquary would alone detect it. It is a site strong by nature, and well adapted for a city, as cities then were. For it is scarcely larger than the Palatine Hill, which, though at first it embraced the whole of Rome, was afterwards too small for a single palace. It has a peculiar interest as one of the 3 cities of Sabina, whose daughters, ravished by the followers of Romulus, became the mothers of the Roman race. Antemne was the nearest city to Rome, only 3 miles distant, and therefore must have suffered most from the inhospitable violence of the Romans. Dennis cities of Etruria, ch. Roman 3. There is a walk rather dangerous for carriages by the river, from hence to the Pont Mall. Here Miss Bathurst was drowned by being thrown from her horse into the Tiber. The river bank presents a series of picturesque views, though the yellow Tiber in no way reminds us of Virgil's description. Caeruleus Tibris Silo, gratissimus amnes. En Romanate, 64. Continuing to follow the main road, on the left is the round church of St. Andrew, with a Doric portico built by Vignola in 1527 to commemorate the deliverance of Clement Roman 7 from the Germans. Further, on the right, is another chapel in honor of St. Andrew's head. One of the most curious instances of relique worship occurred here in the reign of Aeneas Sylvius, Pope Pius Roman II. The head of St. Andrew was brought in stately procession from the fortress of Narni, whither, as the Turks invaded the Mora, it had been brought for safety from Patras. It was intended that the most glorious heads of St. Peter and St. Paul should go forth to meet that of their brother apostle. But the mass of gold which enshrined, the cumbrous iron which protected these reliques, was too heavy to be moved. So, without them, the Pope, the cardinals, the whole population of Rome, thronged forth to the meadows near the Milvian Bridge. The Pope made an eloquent address to the head. A hymn was sung entreating the saints' aid in the discomfiture of the Turks. It rested that day on the altar of Santa Maria del Popolo, and was then conveyed through the city, decorated with all splendor, to St. Peter's. Cardinal Bessarion preached a sermon, and the head was deposited with those of his brother apostles under the high altar. Milman's Latin Christianity. A mile and a half from the gate, the Tiber is crossed by the Pont Mall, built by Pius Roman 7. In 1815, on the site and foundations of the Pons Milvius, which was erected BC 109 by the censor M. Aemilius Scaurus. It was here that, on the night of December 3, BC 63, Cicero captured the emissaries of the Allobrogi, who were engaged in the conspiracy of Catiline. Hence, on October 27, AD 312, Maxentius was thrown into the river and drowned after his defeat by Constantine at the Saxa Rubra. It was on this occasion that the 7-branched candlestick of Jerusalem was dropped into the river, where it has probably ever since been embedded. The statues of our Savior and John the Baptist, at the further entrance of the bridge, are by Machi. Here are a number of taverns and trattorie, much frequented by the lower ranks of the Roman people, and for which especial open omnibuses run from the Porta del Popolo. Similar places of public amusement seem to have existed here from imperial times. Ovid describes the people coming out hither in troops by the Via Flaminia to celebrate the fete of Anna Perina, an old woman who supplied the plebs with cakes during the retreat to the Mons Sacer, but who afterwards, from a similitude of names, was confounded with Anna, sister of Dido. Idibus est Anna festum genial perini, hod procula ripes advena tibri tuis, plebs venit, ac virids passum disjecta per herbis patate, et accumbit compare quisque sua, sub jove pars durat, possae tentoria ponant sunt, quibus e ramo frondia facta casa est pars, ubi pro rigidis calamos statuor columnis, de super extentas impossera togas. Sol tamen vinoc calent, anosc precanter, quat sumint seathos, ad numerumque bibunt. Invents alic, qui nestoris ebibat annos, qui sit per calix facta sibylla sues, illic et cantant, quidquid didicere theatris, et jactant faciles ad sua verba manus et ducunt posito duras crater curias, multec diffusis saltet amica commis, quam redunt titubant et sunt spectacula vulgo, et fortunatos obvia turba vocet, occurri nuper. Visa est mihi digna relatu pampa, senum potum poda trahibat anus. Fast, Roman 3, 523. Here 3 roads meet. That on the right is the old Via Flaminia, begun B.C. 220 by C. Flaminius the censor. This was the Great Northern Road of Italy, which, issuing from the city by the Porta Radomina, which was close to the tomb of Bibulus, followed a line a little east of the modern Corso, and passed the Aurelian Wall by the Porta Flaminia, near the present Porta del Popolo. It extended to Ariminum Rimini, a distance of 210 miles. Following this road for about 1.5 miles, on the left are the ruins called Tor di Quinto. A little further on the right of the road are some tufa rocks, with an injured tomb of the Nassones. Following the valley under these rocks to the left we reach, 1.5 miles, the fine castle of Crescenza, now a farm asterisk house, picturesquely situated on a rocky knoll once inhabited by Poussin and reproduced in the background of many of his pictures. In the interior are some remains of ancient frescoes. On this road, 7 miles from Rome, is Prima Porta, where are the ruins of the villa of Livia, wife of Augustus and mother of Tiberius. When first opened, several small rooms in the villa, supposed to be baths, were covered with frescoes and arabesques in a state of the most marvelous beauty and preservation, but they are now greatly injured by damp and exposure. From the character of the paintings, a trellis asterisk work of fruit and flowers, amid which birds and insects are sporting, it is supposed that they are the work of Ludius, described in Pliny, who, divi Augusti edate primus instituit ammonissimam periodum picturam, villas et porticus ac topiaria opera, lucos, nemora. Blandissimo aspectu minimoque impendio. It was here that the magnificent statue of Augustus, now in the Braccio Nuovo of the Vatican, was discovered in 1863. What Augustus's affection for Livia was, is well known. "Preserve the remembrance of a husband who has loved you very tenderly," were the last words of the emperor, as he lay on his deathbed. And when asked how she contrived to retain his affection, Dion Cassius tells us that she replied, "My secret is very simple. I have made it the study of my life to please him, and I have never manifested any indiscreet curiosity with regard to his public or private affairs." Weld. Just beyond this, the Tiber receives the little river Valca, considered to be identical with the Crimea. Hither the devoted clan of the Fabii, 4,000 in number, retired from Rome, having offered to sustain, at their own cost and risk, the war which Rome was then carrying on against Veii. Here, because they felt a position within the city untenable on account of the animosity of their fellow patricians, which had been excited by their advocacy of the agrarian law, and their popularity with the plebeians, they established themselves on a hillock overhanging the river, which they fortified, and where they dwelt for 3 years. At the end of that time, the Veientines, by letting loose herds of cattle like the vaccine, which one still sees wandering in that part of the Campagna, drew them into an ambuscade, and they were all cut off to a man. According to Dionysius, a portion of the little army remained to guard the fort, and the rest fled to another hill, perhaps that now known as Vacarxia. These were the last to be exterminated. They fought from dawn to sunset. The enemy slain by their hand formed heaps of corpses which barred their passage. They were summoned to surrender, but they preferred to die. The people of Veii showered arrows and stones upon them from a distance, not daring to approach them again. The arrows fell like thick snow. The Fabii, with swords blunted by force of striking, with bucklers broken, continued to fight, snatching fresh swords from the hands of the enemy and rushing upon them with the ferocity of wild beasts. Dionysius Roman 9:21. A little beyond this, 10 miles from Rome, is the stream Scanabche, which descends from the Crustuminian hills, and is identical with the Alia in Faustum Alia Nomen, where the Romans were BC 390, entirely defeated with great slaughter by the Gauls, before the capture of the city, in which the aged senators were massacred at the doors of their houses. It was in the lands lying between the villa of Livia and the Tiber that Saxa Rubra was situated, where Constantine, AD 312, gained his decisive victory over Maxentius, who, while attempting to escape over the Milvian Bridge, was pushed by the throng of fugitives into the Tiber, and perished, engulfed in the mud. The scene is depicted in the famous fresco of Giulio Romano in the stands of the Vatican. On the opposite side of the river, Castel Giubileo, on the site of the Etruscan Fidni, is a conspicuous object. The direct road from the Pont Mall is the ancient Via Cassia, which must be followed for some distance by those who make the interesting excursions to Veii, Galera, and Bracciano, each easily within the compass of a day's expedition. On the left of this road, 3 miles from Rome, is the fine sarcophagus of Publius Vibius Maximus and his wife Regina Maxima, popularly known as Nero's tomb. Following the road to the left of the Pont Mall, we turn up a steep incline to the deserted Villa Madama, built by Giulio Romano, from designs of Raphael for Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, afterwards Clement Roman VII. It derives its name from Margaret of Austria, daughter of Charles V, and wife first of Alessandro de' Medici and then of Ottavio Farnese, Duke of Parma. From this second marriage, it descended through Elisabetta Farnese to the Bourbon kings of Naples. The neglected halls contain some fresco decorations by Giulio Romano and Giovanni da Udine. They consist of a series of beautiful little pictures representing the sports of satyrs and loves, Juno, attended by her peacocks, Jupiter and Ganymede, and various subjects of mythology and fable. The paintings in the portico have been of first-rate excellence, and I cannot but regret that designs so beautiful should not be engraved before their last traces disappear forever. A deep fringe on one of the deserted chambers, representing angels, flowers, caryatides, and sea, by Giulio Romano, and also a fine fresco on a ceiling by Giovanni da Udine of Phoebus driving his heavenly steeds, are in somewhat better preservation. It was in the groves that surrounded Villa Madama that the pastor Fido of Garini was represented for the first time before a brilliant circle of princes and nobles, such as these scenes will see no more, and Italy itself could not now produce. Eaton's Rome. The frescoes and arabesques executed here by Giovanni da Udine were considered at the time as among the most successful of his works. Vasari says that in these he wished to be supreme and to excel himself. Cardinal de' Medici was so delighted with them that he not only heaped benefits on all the relations of the painter, but rewarded him with a rich canonry, which he was allowed to transfer to his brother. One can scarcely doubt from the description of Martial that this villa occupies the site of that in which the poet came to visit his friend and namesake. Juli jugera pauca Martialis, hordes hesperidum bitera, longo geniculi jugo recumbunt, lati colibus imminent recessus, et planus modico tumor vertex silo perfruder serenir, et, curvas nebula tegent vols, salus luce nitet peculiari, puris leniter id moventer astris celsi culmina delicata villi, hinc septem dominos viter montes, et totem licet sestimare ramem. The Villa Madama is situated on one of the slopes of Monte Mario, which is ascended by a winding carriage road from near the Porta Angelica. This hill, in ancient times called Clivicini, was in the Middle Ages Monte Malo, and is thus spoken of by Dante, Paradiso, Roman 15, 109. Its name changed to Mario, through Mario Mellini, its possessor in the time of Sixtus V, passing the two churches of Sta. Maria del Rosario and Sta. Croce di Monte Mario, we reach a gate with an old pine tree. This is the Villa Mellini, for which an order is supposed to be necessary, though a frank will usually cause the gates to fly open, which possesses a magnificent view over Rome, from its terraces, lined with ilexes and cypresses. The Monte Mario, like Cooper's Hill, is the highest, boldest, and most prominent part of the line. It is about the height and steepness, too, of Cooper's Hill, and has the Tiber at the foot of it, like the Thames at Ankerwick. To keep up the resemblance, there is a sort of terrace at the top of the Monte Mario, planted with cypresses, and a villa, though dilapidated, crowns the summit, as well as at our old friend above Egem. Here we stood on a most delicious evening, the ilex and the gum cistus in great profusion about us, the slope below full of vines and olives, the cypresses above our heads, and before our eyes all that one has read of in Roman history, the course of the Tiber between the hills that bound it, coming down from Fidene and receiving the Allia and the Anio. Beyond, the Apennines, the distant and higher summits still quite white with snow. In front, the Alban Hills. On the right, the Campagna to the sea. And just beneath us the whole length of Rome, ancient and modern St. Peter's and the Colosseum, rising as the representatives of each the Pantheon, the Aventine, the Quirinal, all the well-known objects distinctly laid before us. One may safely say that the world cannot contain many views of such mingled beauty and interest as this. Dr. Arnold. Les Masons de Campagny des Grands Seigneurs donnent elide de cette solitude, de cette indifference des possesseurs au milieu des plus admirables sagers du monde. On s'y promène dans ces immenses jardins, sans si douter quils ayant un maître. Elherbe croit au milieu des allées, Et dans ces mermes allées abandonnées, les arbres sont les artistements, cellen elanchen gaut qui regnate en France. Singulière bizarrerie que cette négligence du nécessaire, et cette affectation de l'inutile, mad, de style. Behind the Monte Mario, about 4 miles from Rome, is the church of S. Onofrio in Campagna, with a curious ossuary. Just outside the Porta Angelica was the vineyard in which Alexander Roman VI died. This is the manner in which Pope Alexander Roman VI came to his death. The Cardinal Datary, Arian de Corneto, having received a gracious intimation that the pontiff, together with the Duke Valentinos, designed to come and sup with him at his vineyard, and that his holiness would bring the supper with him, the cardinal suspected that this determination had been taken for the purpose of destroying his life by poison, to the end that the duke might have his riches and appointments, the rather as he knew that the pope had resolved to put him to death by some means, with a view to seizing his property, as I have said, which was very great. Considering of the means by which he might save himself, he could see but one hope of safety. He sent in good time to the pope's carver, with whom he had a certain intimacy, desiring that he would come to speak with him. Who, when he had come to the said cardinal, was taken by him into a secret place, where, they two being retired, the cardinal showed the carver a sum, prepared beforehand, of 10,000 ducats in gold, which the said cardinal persuaded the carver to accept as a gift and to keep for love of him. And after many words, they were at length accepted, the cardinal offering, moreover, all the rest of his wealth at his command, for he was a very rich cardinal. For he said that he could not keep the said riches by any other means than through the said carver's aid, and declared to him, "You know of a certainty what the nature of the pope is, and I know that he has resolved, with the Duke Valentinos, to procure my life by poison, through your hand, wherefore he besought the carver to take pity on him, and to give him his life." And having said this, the carver declared to him the manner in which it was ordered that the poison should be given to him at the supper, but being moved to compassion, he promised to preserve his life. Now the orders were that the carver should present 3 boxes of sweetmeats, in tablets or lozenges, after the supper, one to the pope, one to the said cardinal, and another to the duke, and in that for the cardinal there was poison. And thus being told, the said cardinal gave directions to the aforesaid carver in what manner he should serve them, so as to cause that the box of poisoned confect which was to be for the cardinal should be placed before the pope, so that he might eat thereof, and so poison himself and die. And the pope being come accordingly with the duke to supper on the day appointed, the cardinal threw himself at his feet, kissing them and embracing them closely. Then he entreated his holiness with most affectionate words, saying he would never rise from those feet until his holiness had granted him a favor. Being questioned by the pontiff what this favor was, and requested to rise up, he would first have the grace he demanded, and the promise of his holiness to grant it. Now, after much persuasion, the pope remained sufficiently astonished, seeing the perseverance of the cardinal, and that he would not rise, and promised to grant the favor. Then the cardinal rose up and said, "Holy Father, it is not fitting that when the master comes to the house of his servant, the servant should eat with his master like an equal confessor parament. And therefore the grace he demanded was the just and honest one, that he, the servant, should wait at the table of his master. And this favor the pope granted him. Then having come to supper, and the time for serving the confectionery having arrived, the carver put the poisoned sweetmeats into the box, according to the first order given to him by the pope, and the cardinal, being well informed as to which box had no poison, tasted of that one, and put the poisoned confect before the pope. Then his holiness, trusting to his carver, and seeing the cardinal tasting, judged that no poison was there, and ate of it heartily, while of the other, which the pope thought was poisoned, but which was not, the cardinal ate. Now at the hour accustomed, according to the quality of that poison, his holiness began to feel its effect, and so died thereof. But the cardinal, who was yet much afraid, having physicked himself and vomited, took no harm and escaped, though not without difficulty. Sanudo Roman 4, translation in ranks hist of the popes. The wine of the Vatican Hill has had a bad reputation even from classical times. "If you like vinegar," wrote Martial, "drink the wine of the Vatican." And again, to drink the wine of the Vatican is to drink poison. Here also is the entrance of the Val di Inferno, a pleasant winter walk, where, near the beginning of the Cork Woods, are some picturesque remains of an ancient nymphaeum. The Porta Angelica, built by Pius Roman IV. 1559–1566, leads into the Borgo, beneath the walls of the Vatican. Those who return from hence to the English Quarter in the evening will realize the vividness of Miss Thackeray's description. They passed groups standing round their doorways, a blacksmith hammering with great straight blows at a copper pot, shouting to a friend, a young baker, naked almost, except for a great sheet flung over his shoulders and leaning against the door of his shop. The horses tramp on. Listen to the flow of fountains gleaming white against the dark marbles, to the murmur of voices. An old lady, who has apparently hung all her wardrobe out of window, in petticoats and silk handkerchiefs, is looking out from beneath these banners at the passers in the streets. Little babies, tied up tight in swaddling clothes, are being poised against their mother's hips. A child is trying to raise the great knocker of some feudal-looking arch, hidden in the corner of the street. Then they cross the bridge and see the last sun's rays flaming from the angel's sacred sword. Driving on through the tranquil streets, populous and thronged with citizens, they see brown-faced, bronze-headed torsos in balconies and window frames. Citizens sitting tranquilly, resting on the curb asterisk stones, with their feet in the gutters, grand-looking women resting against their doorways. Sibyls out of the Sistine were sitting on the steps of the churches. In one stone archway sat the Fates spinning their web. There was a Holy Family by a lemonade shop, and a whole heaven of little Correggio angels perching dark-eyed along the road. Then comes a fountain falling into a marble basin, at either end of which two little girls are clinging and climbing. Here is a little lighted May altar to the Virgin, which the children have put up under the shrine by the street corner. They don't beg clamorously, but stand leaning against the wall, waiting for a chance miraculous Bayach, Bluebeard's keys. Chapter 20. The Janiculum. Gate of Stowe. Spirito Church, Convent, and Garden of S. Onofrio the Lungara Palazzo Salviati and the Botanic Garden S. Giovanni alla Lungara Palazzo Corsini the Farnesina Porta, Settimiana S. Pietro, in Montorio Fontana, Paolina Villa Lantporta, and Church of S. Pancrazio Villa, Doria Pamphili Chapel of St. Andrew's Head. The Janiculum is a steep crest of hill which rises abruptly on the west bank of the Tiber, and breaks imperceptibly away on the other side into the Campagna towards Civita Vecchia. Its lower formation is a marine clay abounding in fossils, but its upper surface is formed of the yellow sand, which gave it the ancient name of Mons Aurea, still commemorated in Montorio S. Pietro in Montorio. A tradition universally received in ancient times and adopted by Virgil derives the name of Janiculum from Janus, who was the sun god, as Jana or Diana was the moon goddess. On this hill Janus is believed to have founded a city, which is mentioned by Pliny under the name of Antinopolis. Ovid makes Janus speak for himself as to his property. Arx me callis erat, quem cultrix nomen nostro nuncupat hic edas, Janiculum vocet. Fons, the supposed son of Janus, is known to have had an altar here in very early times. Janus Quirinus was a war god, the sun armed with a lance. Thus, in time of peace, the gates of this temple were closed, both because his worship was then unnecessary and from an idea of preventing war from going forth. It was probably in this character that he was honored on a site which the Romans looked upon as the key of Etruria, while other nations naturally regarded it as the key of Rome. Janus was represented as having a key in his hand. Ille tenens dextra baculum, clavum sinistra. Paran hasard singulier Janus, quan representate un clef a la main, etate la du Janicule, voicen du Vatican, u est latamo de Saint Pierre, que elan represent ossi tenent un clef, Janus, comme Saint Pierre, son futur voicen, etate la portier celeste. Ampere hist. Rom. I 229. When the first Sabine king of Rome, Numa Pompilius, like the darlings of the gods in the Golden Age, fell asleep, full of days, he was buried upon the sacred hill of his own people, and the books of his sacred laws and ordinances were buried near him in a separate tomb. In the 6th century of the Republic, a monument was discovered on the Janiculum, which was believed to be that of Numa, and certain books were dug up near it, which were destroyed by the Senate in the fear that they might give a too free asterisk-thinking explanation of the Roman mythology. Ancus Martius, the 4th king of Rome, connected the Janiculum with the rest of the city by building the pons Sublicius, the first bridge over the Tiber, and erected a citadel on the crest of the hill as a bulwark against Etruria, with which he was constantly at war. Some escarpments, supposed to belong to the fortifications of Ancus, have lately been found behind the Fontana Paulina. It was from this same ridge that his Etruscan successor, Tarquinius Priscus, coming from Tarquinii Corneto, had his first view of the city over which he came to reign, and here the eagle, henceforth to be the emblem of Roman power, replaced upon his head the cap which it had snatched away as he was riding in his chariot. Hence also Lars Porsena, king of Etruria, looked upon Rome when he came to the assistance of Tarquinius Superbus, and retired in fear of his life after he had seen specimens of Roman endurance in Horatius Cockles, who kept the falling bridge, in Mutius, who burnt his hand in the charcoal, and in the hostage, Celia, who swam home across the Tiberal anecdotes connected with the Janiculum. After the time of the kings, this hill appears less frequently in history. But it was here that the consul Octavius, the friend of Sylla, was murdered by the partisans of Marius, while seated in his curule chair near the foot of the hill Julius Caesar had his famous gardens, and on its summit the Emperor Galba was buried. The Christian associations of the hill will be noticed at the different points to which they belong. From the Borgo, chapter Roman 15. The unfinished gate called Porta Sto, Spirito, built by Antonio de San Gallo, leads into the Via Lungara, a street 3/4 of a mile long, formed by Sixtus V, and occupying the whole length of the valley between the Tiber and the Janiculum. Immediately on the right, the steep Salita di S. Onofrio leads up the hillside to the church of S. Onofrio, built in 1439 by Niccolo de Forca Palna, in honor of the Egyptian hermit Onofrius. Saint Onofrius was a monk of Thebes, who retired to the desert, far from the sight of men, and dwelt there in a cave for 60 years, and during all that time never beheld one human being or uttered one word of his mother tongue except in prayer. He was unclothed, except by some leaves twisted round his body, and his beard and hair had become like the face of a wild beast. In this state he was discovered by a holy man whose name was Paphnutius, who, seeing him crawling on the ground, knew not at first what live thing it might be. Jameson's Sacred Art. From the little platform in front of the convent is one of the loveliest views over the city. The church is approached by a portico, decorated with glazed frescoes by Domnicino. Those on either side of the door represent the saints of the Hieronomite order. The adjoining convent belongs to Hieronomites, viz. S. Jerome, Sta. Paula, St. Eustachium S. Pietro Gambacorda of Pisa, St. Augustine the Hermit, S. Niccolo di Forca Palna, S. Onofrio and the Blessed Benedict of Sicily, Philip of St. Agatha, Paul of Venice, Bartholomew of Caesarea, Mark of Manuda, Philip of Bulgaria, and John of Catalonia. Over the door is a Madonna and Child. In the side arcade are 3 scenes in the life of St. Jerome. 1 represents his baptism as a young man at Rome. 2 refers to his vision of the judgment described in his letter to Eustachium, in which he heard the judge of the world ask what he was, and he answered, "I am a Christian." But the judge replied, "No, you lie, for you are a Ciceronian," and he was condemned to be scourged, but continued to protest that he was a Christian between every lash. 3 is a scene alluded to in another letter to Eustachium, in which Jerome says, "Oh, how often when alone in the desert with the wild beasts and scorpions, half dead with fasting and penance, have I fancied myself a spectator of the sins of Rome and of the dances of its young women." The church has a solemn and picturesque interior. It ends in a tribune richly adorned with frescoes, those of the upper part, the coronation of the Virgin, and 8 groups of saints and angels being by Pinturicchio, those of the lower, the Virgin and Saints, Nativity, and Flight into Egypt by Baldassare Peruzzi. On the left of the entrance is the original monument of Tasso, with a portrait, erected after his death by Cardinal Bevilacqua. Greatly inferior in interest is a monument recently placed to his memory in the adjoining chapel, by subscription, the work of de Fabris. Near this is the grave of the poet, Alessandro Guidi, ob. 1712. In the 3rd chapel on the left is the grave of the learned Cardinal Mezzofanti, born at Bologna, 1774, died at Rome, 1849. The 1st chapel on the right, which is low and vaulted with stumpy pillars, is covered with frescoes relating to S. Onofrio. The second chapel on the right, which is very richly decorated, contains a Madonna crowned by angels by Annibale Carracci. Beyond this is the fine tomb of Archbishop Sakai, Ob 1502. The beautiful lunette of the Madonna teaching the Holy Child to read is by Pinturicchio. The tomb is inscribed, Labor et gloria vita fuit, mors requis. Ladies are never admitted to visit the convent, except on April 25th, the anniversary of the death of Tasso. It is approached by a cloister, decorated with frescoes from the life of S. Onofrio. S. Onofrio is represented as a meager old man, with long hair and beard, gray and matted, a leafy branch twisted round his loins, a stick in his hand. The artist generally tries to make him look as haggard and inhuman as possible. Mrs. Jameson. In a passage on the first floor is a beautiful fresco of the Virgin and Child with the Donor, by Leonardo da Vinci. To 1513 belongs a Madonna, painted on the wall of the upper corridor of the convent of S. Onofrio. It is on a gold ground. The action of the Madonna is beautiful, displaying the noblest form, and the expression of the countenance is peculiarly sweet. But the Child, notwithstanding his graceful action, is somewhat hard and heavy, so as almost to warrant the conclusion that this picture belongs to an earlier period, which would suppose a previous visit to Rome. Kugler. Torquato Tasso came to Rome in 1594 on the invitation of Clement Roman VIII, that he might be crowned on the Capitol, but as he arrived in the month of November, and the weather was then very bad, it was decided to postpone the ceremony till late in the following spring. This delay was a source of trouble to Tasso, who was in feeble health, and had a presentiment that his death was near. Before the time for his crowning arrived, he had removed to S. Onofrio, saying to the monks who received him at the entrance, "My fathers, I have come to die amongst you." And he wrote to one of his friends, "I am come to begin my conversation in heaven in this elevated place, and in the society of these holy fathers." During the 14 days of his illness, he became perfectly absorbed in the contemplation of divine subjects, and upon the last day of his life, when he received the papal absolution, exclaimed, "I believe that the crown which I looked for upon the Capitol is to be changed for a better crown in heaven." Throughout the last night, a monk prayed by his side till the morning, when Tasso was heard to murmur, "In manus tuas, Domine," and then he died. The room in which he expired, April 25, 1595, contains his bust, crucifix, inkstand, autograph, a mask taken from his face after death, and other relics. The archives of S. Onofrio have this entry. Torquato Tasso, illustrious from his genius, died thus in our monastery of S. Onofrio. In April 1595, he caused himself to be brought here that he might prepare for death with greater devotion and security as he felt his end approaching. He was received courteously by our fathers and conducted to chambers in the loggia, where everything was ready for him. Soon afterwards he became dangerously ill and desired to confess and receive the most holy sacrament from the prior. Being asked to write his will, he said that he wished to be buried at S. Onofrio, and he left to the convent his crucifix and 50 scudi for alms, that so many masses might be said for his soul, in the manner that is read in the Book of Legacies in our archives. Pope Clement Roman VIII was requested for his benediction, which he gave amply for the remission of sins. In his last days he received extreme unction, and then, with the crucifix in his hand, contemplating and kissing the sacred image with Christian contrition and devotion, being surrounded by our fathers, he gave up his spirit to the Creator on April 25, 1595, between the 11th and 12th hours, i.e., between 7 and 8 a.m., in the 50th year of his age. In the evening his body was interred with universal concourse in our church, near the steps of the high altar, the Cardinal Giulio Aldobrandini, under whose protection he had lived during the last years, being minded to erect to him, as soon as possible, a sumptuous sepulchre, which, however, was never carried into effect. But after the death of the latter, the Signor Cardinal Bevilacqua raised to his memory the monument which is seen on entering the church on the left side. Ladies are admitted to the beautiful garden of the convent, on ringing at the first large gate on the left below the church. This lovely plot of ground, fresh with running streams, possesses a glorious view over the city, and the Campagna beyond S. Paolo. At the further extremity, near a picturesque group of cypresses, are remains of the oak planted by Tasso, the greater part of which was blown down in 1842. A young sapling is shooting up beside it. Beyond this is the little amphitheater, overgrown with grass and flowers, where S. Filippo Neri used to teach children and assemble them for the half-dramatic musical performances which were an original form of his oratorios. Here every 25th of April, a musical entertainment of the Accademia is held in memory of Tasso his bust, crowned with laurel wreaths and taken from the cast after death, being placed in the center of the amphitheater. Returning to the Lungara, on the left is a lunatic asylum, founded by Pius Roman IX, with a pompous inscription, and beyond it, a chain bridge to S. Giovanni dei Fiorentini. On the right is the handsome Palazzo Salviati, which formerly contained a fine collection of pictures, removed to the Borghese Palace, when, upon the property falling into the hands of Prince Borghese, he sold the palace to the government, who now use it as a repository for the civil archives. The adjoining garden now belongs to the Sapienza and has been turned into a botanic garden. The modernized church of S. Giovanni alla Lungara dates from the time of Leo Roman IV, 845–857, and is now attached to a reformatory. On the right is a large convent of the Buon Pastor. We now reach, on the right, the magnificent Palazzo Corsini, built originally by the Riario family, from whom it was bought by Clement Roman XII. In 1729, for his nephew Cardinal Neri Corsini, for whom it was altered to its present form by Fuga. This palace was in turn the resort of Caterina Sforza, the brave Duchess of Imola, of the learned poet Cardinal di S. Giorgio, of Michelangelo, who remained here more than a year on a visit to the cardinal, who, says Vasari, being of small understanding in art, gave him no commission, and of Erasmus, who always remembered the pleasant conversations, confabulations melliflui of the Riario Palace, as it was then called. In the 17th century, the palace became the residence of Queen Christina of Sweden, who died here on April 19, 1689, in a room which is distinguished by 2 columns of painted wood. With her residence in Rome, the habits of Christina became more tranquil and better regulated. She obtained some mastery over herself, suffered certain considerations of what was due to others to prevail, and consented to acknowledge the necessities incident to the peculiarities of her chosen residence. She took a constantly increasing part in the splendor, the life, and the business of the curia, becoming indeed eventually altogether identified with its interests. The collections she had brought with her from Sweden she now enlarged by so liberal an expenditure, and with so much taste, judgment, and success, that she surpassed even the native families, and elevated the pursuit from a mere gratification of curiosity to a higher and more significant importance both for learning and art. Men such as Spanheim and Haverkamp thought the illustration of her coins and medals an object not unworthy of their labors, and Sant Bartolo devoted his practiced hand to her cameos. The correggios of Christina's collection have always been the richest ornament of every gallery into which the changes of time have carried them. The MSS of her choice have contributed in no small degree to maintain the reputation of the Vatican Library, into which they were subsequently incorporated. Acquisitions and possessions of this kind filled up the hours of her daily life, with an enjoyment that was at least harmless. She also took interest and an active part in scientific pursuits, and it is much to her credit that she received the poor exiled Borelli, who was compelled to resort in his old age to teaching as a means of subsistence. The Queen supported him with her utmost power, and caused his renowned and still unsurpassed work on the mechanics of animal motion, by which physiological science has been so importantly influenced and advanced, to be printed at her own cost. Nay, I think we may even venture to affirm that she herself, when her character and intellect had been improved and matured, exerted a powerfully efficient and enduring influence on the period, more particularly on Italian literature. In the year 1680, she founded an academy in her own residence for the discussion of literary and political subjects, and the first rule of this institution was that its members should carefully abstain from the turgid style, overloaded with false ornament, which prevailed at the time, and be guided only by sound sense and the models of the Augustan and Medician ages. From the Queen's academy proceeded such men as Alessandro Guidi, who had previously been addicted to the style then used, but after some time passed in the society of Christina, he not only resolved to abandon it, but even formed a league with some of his friends for the purpose of laboring to abolish it altogether. The Arcadia, an academy to which the merit of completing this good work is attributed, arose out of the society which assembled around the Swedish queen. On the whole, it must needs be admitted that in the midst of the various influences pressing around her, Christina preserved a noble independence of mind. To the necessity for evincing that ostentatious piety usually expected from converts, or which they impose on themselves, she would by no means subject herself. Entirely Catholic as she was, and though continually repeating her conviction of the Pope's infallibility, and of the necessity for believing all doctrines enjoined either by himself or the Church, she had nevertheless an extreme detestation of bigots, and utterly abhorred the direction of father confessors, who were at that time the exclusive rulers of all social and domestic life. She would not be prevented from enjoying the amusements of the carnival, concerts, dramatic entertainments, or whatever else might be offered by the habits of life at Rome. Above all, she refused to be withheld from the internal movement of an intellectual and animated society. She acknowledged a love of satires, and took pleasure in Pasquin. We find her constantly mingled in the intrigues of the court, the dissensions of the papal houses, and the factions of the cardinals. She attached herself to the mode of life presented to her with a passionate love, and even thought it impossible to live if she did not breathe the atmosphere of Rome. Ranks hist. Of the popes. In 1797, this palace was used as the French embassy. And on the 28th of December was the scene of a terrible skirmish, when Joseph Buonaparte, then ambassador, attempted to interfere between the French Democratic Party and the Papal Dragoons, and when young General Dufat, who was about to be married to Buonaparte's sister-in-law, was shot by his side in a balcony. These events, after which Joseph Buonaparte immediately demanded his passports and departed, were among the chief causes which led to the invasion of Rome by Berthier, and the imprisonment of Pius VII. The collections now in the palace have all been formed since the death of Queen Christina. The picture gallery is open to the public from 9 to 12, every day except Sundays and holidays. The following criticism, applicable to all the private galleries in Rome, is perhaps especially so to this. You may generally form a tolerably correct conjecture of what a gallery will contain, as to subject, before you enter it, a certain quantity of landscapes, a great many holy families, a few crucifixions, 2 or 3 pietas, a reasonable proportion of St. Jerome's, a mixture of other saints and martyrdoms, and a large assortment of Madonnas and Magdalenes make up the principal part of all the collections in Rome, which are generally comprised of quite as many bad as good paintings. Eaton's Rome. The first room is chiefly occupied by pretty but unimportant landscapes by Orizzonti and Vanvitelli, and figure pieces by Locatelli. We may notice the best pictures being marked with an asterisk. First room 26, Canaletti. Second room, Madonna and Child in Glory, Eli's, Serrani, 27, Fruit, Mario di Fiori, Landscape, G. Poussin, 19, Landscapes with Cattle, Bergam, Pieta Laud Carracci, S. Andrea Corsini, Fr. Jesse. Third room, Ex Homo, Guercino, Madonna and Child, A. del Sardo, Holy Family, Barraxai, 20, Rock Scenes, Salvator Rosa, Madonna and Child, Caravaggio, Sunset, both, Holy Family, Fra. Bartolomeo, 2 Martyrdoms, Carlo Saraceni. Julius Roman II, after Raphael. The portrait of Julius Roman II. Della Rover is a replica or copy of that at the Pitti Palace. There are other duplicates in the Borghese Gallery, at the National Gallery in England, and at Lee Court in Somersetshire. Julius Roman II, Ob 1513. Saint Apollonia, Carlo Dolce. Philip Roman II, of Spain, Titian. Vanity, Carlo Saraceni. Ex Homo, Carlo Dolce. Fourth room, Clement Roman XII. Lorenzo Corsini, 1730-40, Benedetto Ludi. Cupid asleep, Guido Rini. Daughter of Herodias, Guido Rini. Madonna, Guido Rini. Christ and the Magdalene, Barraxai. 2 heads, Laud Carracci. Saint Jerome, Titian. Faustina Merita, his daughter, Carlo Merita. Fornarina, Giulio Romano, after Raphael replica of the picture at Florence. Old Man, Guido. A Hare, Albert Dürer. Death of Adonis, Spagnolto. In this room is an ancient marble chair, found near the Lateran end on a table, the Corsini vase, in silver, with reliefs representing the judgment of Areopagus upon the matricide of Orsts. 5th room, in which Christina died, with a ceiling by the Zuccari. Holy Family, Pirino del Vaga, Saint Agnes, Carlo Dolce, Madonna reading, Sassoferrato, Ulysses and Polyphemus, Lanfranco, Madonna and Child, Albani, Madonna and Child, Sassoferrato, Adolorata, Guido Reni, Ex Homo, Guido Reni. Saint John, Guido Reni. 6th room, portrait Holbein, MGR, Ghiberti, Titian. Children of Charles V, Titian, Old Woman, Rembrandt, Male portrait Giorgione, Caterina Bora, wife of Luther, Holbein, Male portrait Van Dyck, Nativity of the Virgin, miniature from Dürer, Cardinal Divitius de Bibbiena, Bronzino, portrait of himself, Rubens, A Doge of Venice, Tintoret, Cardinal Alessandro Farnese, Titian, Cardinal Neri Corsini, Basixio. 7th room, Madonna and Child, Murillo, Landscape G. Poussin, Saint Sebastian, Rubens, Christ bearing the cross, Garofalo, Christ among the doctors, Luca Giordano, Descent of the Holy Spirit, Fra Angelico, Last Judgment, Fra Angelico, Ascension, Fra Angelico. A Last Judgment by Angelico de Fiesole, with wings containing the Ascension and the Descent of the Holy Ghost, is in the Corsini Gallery. Here we perceive a great richness of expression and beauty of drapery. The rapture of the blessed is told, chiefly by their embraces and by their attitudes of prayer and praise. It is a remarkable feature, and one indicative of the Master, that the ranks of the condemned are entirely filled by monks. Kugler. Martyrdom of Saint Bartholomew, Laud, Carracci. Woman taken in adultery, Titian, Gonfaloniere of the Church, Dome Nicino. 8th room, Christ before Pilate, Van Dyck, Saint George, Ercole Grandi, Contemplation, Guido Reni, Landscape, G. Poussin, Judith and Head of Holofernes, Gerard de la Nuit. Saint Jerome, Guercino, Saint Jerome, Spagnolto, Mosaic portrait of Clement Roman XII, and his nephew Cardinal Neri Corsini. In this room are 2 modern family busts with touching inscriptions. Cabinet, Madonna and Child, Spagna. 9th room, Village interior, Teniers, Innocent X, Velázquez, a replica of the Doria portrait. Female portrait, Bronzino, 29. Battle pieces, Salvator Rosa, 2 heads, Giorgione, Madonna Adolorata, Signani, Madonna and Child, Gherardesco de Siena. One of the gems of the collection, a highly finished Madonna and Child of Carlo Dolce, is usually shown in a glass case in the 1st room. The Corsini Library, open every day except Wednesdays, contains a magnificent collection of MSS and engravings founded by Cardinal Neri Corsini. It has also some beautiful original drawings by the old masters. Behind the palace, on the slope of the Janiculum, are large and beautiful gardens adorned with fountains, cypresses, and some grand old plane trees. There is a fine view from the casino on the summit of the hill. A magnificent porter in cocked hat and grand livery conducted the visitors across the quadrangle, unlocked the ponderous iron gates of the gardens, and let them through, leaving them to their own devices and closing and locking the gates with a crash. They now stood in a wide avenue of ilex, whose gloomy boughs, interlacing overhead, effectually excluded the sunlight. Nearly a quarter of a mile further on, the ilexes were replaced by box and bay trees, beneath which the sun and shade divided the path between them, trembling and flickering on the ground and invading each other's dominions with every breath of wind. The strangers heard the splash of fountains as they walked onwards by banks precipitous as a hillside, and covered with wild rank herbage and tall trees. Stooping to gather a flower, they almost started as, looking up, they saw, rising against a sky fabulously blue, the unfamiliar green ilex and dark cypress spire. Mademoiselle Mori. Opposite the Corsini Palace is the beautiful villa of the Farnesina, open on Sundays from 10 to 3. Built in 1506 by Baldassare Peruzzi for the famous banker Agostino Chigi, who here gave his sumptuous and extravagant entertainments to Leo X and his court banquets, at which 3 fish cost as much as 230 crowns, and after which the plate that had been used was all thrown into the Tiber. This same Agostino Chigi was one of the greatest of art patrons, and has handed down to us not only the decorations of the Farnesina, but the Sibyls of Sta. Maria della Pace, which he also ordered from Raphael. Le jour où Leon ex alla prendre possession de la basilique de Latran, l'opulent chigi si distingua. Le théâtre qui s'élevait devant son palais était rempli des envoyés de tous les pupils, blancs, cuivrés et noirs. Au milieu d'on distinguait les images de Vénus, de Mars, de Minerve, allusion singulière aux trois pontificats d'Alexander Roman VI, de Jules Roman II, et de Léon ex Vénus eu son temps. De cette l'inscription, Mars eu le signe, c'est aujourd'hui le regnet de Minerve. Antoine de San Marino, qui demurait prise de Chigi, répandit aussitôt en plaquant sur sa boutique la statue isolée de Vénus, avec si peu de mots, Mars a regne, Minerve regne, Vénus regnera taugers. Gurnery, Rome Creation, Roman II. 109. The Farnesina contains some of the most beautiful existing frescoes of Raphael and his school. The principal hall was once open, but has now been closed in to preserve the paintings. Its ceiling was designed by Raphael, 1500–1820, and painted by Giulio Romano and Francesco Penni, with 12 scenes from the story of Psyche, as narrated by Apuleius. A king had 3 daughters. The youngest was named Psyche and was more lovely than the sunshine. Venus, the queen of beauty, was herself jealous of her, and bade her son Cupid to destroy her charms by inspiring her with an unworthy loved one. But Cupid, when he beheld Psyche, loved her himself, showed her to the Graces, too, and carried her off. He only visited her in the darkness of night, and bade her always to repress her curiosity as to his appearance. But while Cupid was sleeping, Psyche lighted a lamp, and looked upon him, and a drop of the hot oil fell upon him, and he awoke. Then he left her alone in grief and solitude. Venus in the meantime learnt that Cupid was faithless to her, and imprisoned him, and sought assistance from Juno and Ceres that she might find Psyche, but they refused to aid her. 3. Then she drove to seek Jupiter in her chariot drawn by doves. 4. And implored him to send Mercury to her assistance. 5. Jupiter listened to her prayer, and Mercury was sent forth to seek for Psyche. 6. Venus then showed her spite against Psyche, and imposed harsh tasks upon her which she was nevertheless enabled to perform. At length she was ordered to bring a casket from the infernal regions. 7. And even this, to the amazement of Venus, she succeeded in effecting. 8. Cupid, escaped from captivity, then implored Jupiter to restore Psyche to him. Jupiter embraced him. 9. And bade Mercury summon the gods to a council on the subject. See the ceiling on the right. Psyche was then brought to Olympus. 10. And became immortal, and the gods celebrated her nuptial banquet. Ceiling painting on left. On the flat of the ceiling are 2 large compositions, with numerous figures: the judgment of the gods, who decide the dispute between Venus and Cupid, and the marriage of Cupid and Psyche in the festal assembly of the gods. In the lunettes of the ceiling are amorini, with the attributes of those gods who have done homage to the power of love. In the triangular compartments between the lunettes are different groups, illustrative of the incidents in the fable. They are of great beauty, and are examples of the most tasteful disposition in a given space. The picture of the 3 Graces, that in which Cupid stands in an imploring attitude before Jupiter, a third, where Psyche is borne away by loves, are extremely graceful. Peevish critics have designated these representations as common and sensual, but the noble spirit visible in all Raphael's works prevails also in these. Religious feeling could naturally find no place in them, but they are conceived in a spirit of the purest artlessness, always a proof of true moral feeling, and to which a narrow taste alone could object. In the execution, indeed, we recognize little of Raphael's fine feeling. The greatest part is by his scholars, after his cartoons, especially by G. Romano. The nearest of the 3 Graces, in the group before alluded to, appears to be by Raphael's own hand, Kugler. The paintings were injuriously retouched by Carlo Meretta. The garlands round them are by Giovanni di Udine. The second room contains the beautiful fresco of Galatea floating in a shell drawn by dolphins, by Raphael himself. Raphael not only designed but executed this fresco, and faded as is its coloring, the mind must be dead to the highest beauties of painting, that can contemplate it without admiration. The spirit and beauty of the composition, the pure and perfect design, the flowing outline, the soft and graceful contours, and the sentiment and sweetness of the expression all remain unchanged. For time, till it totally obliterates, has no power to injure them. The figures of the attendant Nereid and of the triumphant Triton who embraces her are beautiful beyond description. Eaton's Rome. Fresco of Galatea was painted in 1514. The greater part of this is Raphael's own work, and the execution is consequently much superior to that of the others. It represents the goddess of the sea borne over the waves in her shell. Tritons and sea nymphs sport joyously around her. Amorini, discharging their arrows, appear in the air like an angel glory. The utmost sweetness, the most ardent sense of pleasure, breathe from this work. Everything lives, feels, vibrates with enjoyment. Kugler. The frescoes of the ceiling, representing Diana in her car, and the story of Medusa, are by Baldassare Peruzzi. The lunettes are by Sebastian del Piombo and Daniel de Volterra. Michelangelo came one day to visit the latter, and not finding him at his work, left the colossal head, which remains in a lunette of the left wall, as a sign of his visit. In the upper story are 2 rooms. The first, adorned with a frieze of subjects from Ovid's Metamorphoses, contains large architectural paintings by Baldassare Peruzzi. The second has the marriage of Alexander and Roxana, and the family of Darius in the presence of Alexander, by Sodoma. The Porta Setimiana at the end of the Lungara preserves in its name a recollection of the gardens of Septimius Severus, which existed in this quarter. From hence, the Via del Fornaci ascends the hill, and leads to the broad new carriage road, formed in 1867 under the superintendence of the Cav. Trochai. A via crucis with a staircase will conduct the pedestrian by a shorter way to the platform on the hilltop. The succession of beggars who infest this hill and stretch out their maimed limbs or kiss their hands to the passers-by will call to mind the lines of Juvenal. Cicus adulator, durusque apont saddles, dignus aracinos qui mendicaret ad axes, blandec devexi jactaret basia redi. Sat Roman 4, 116. The church of S. Pietro in Montorio was built by Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, from designs of Baxio Pintelli, on the site of an oratory founded by Constantine upon the supposed spot of St. Peter's crucifixion. The first chapel on the right belongs to the Barberini and contains pictures by Sebastian del Piombo, painted in oil upon stone, a process which has caused them to be much blackened by time, from drawings of Michelangelo. The central picture represents the scourging of Christ, a subject of which Sebastian was especially fond, as it gave the opportunity of displaying his great anatomical power. On the left is St. Peter. On the right, St. Francis. On the ceiling is the Transfiguration. Outside the arch are a prophet and a sibyl. The second chapel on the right has paintings by pupils of Perugino. The fifth contains St. Paul healed by Ananias, by Vasari. The fourth chapel on the right is of some interest in the history of art. Julius Roman 3 had it greatly at heart to build and beautify this chapel as a memorial to his family, to contain the tombs of his uncle Cardinal Antonio di Monti and of Fabiano, who first founded the splendors of his house. The work was entrusted to Michelangelo and Vasari, who were at that time on terms of intimate friendship. They disputed about their subordinates. Vasari wished to employ Simone Mosca for the ornaments and Raffaello da Montelupo for the statues. Michelangelo objected to having any ornamental work at all, saying that where there were to be marble figures, there ought to be nothing else, and he would have nothing to do with Montelupo because his figures for the tomb of Julius Roman II had turned out so ill. When the chapel was finished, Michelangelo confessed himself in the wrong for not having allowed more ornament. The statues were entrusted to Bartolomeo Ammanati. The first chapel on the left has St. Francis receiving the stigmata attributed to Giovanni de Vecchi. A barber of the Cardinal S. Giorgio was an artist who painted very well in tempera but had no idea of design. He made friends with Michelangelo, who made him a cartoon of a St. Francis receiving the stigmata, which the barber carefully carried out in color, and his picture is now placed in the first chapel on the left of the entrance of S. Pietro in Montorio. Vasari, Roman 6. The third chapel on the left contains a Virgin and Child with Saint Anne of the School of Perugino. The fourth, a fine entombment by an unknown hand. The fifth, the Baptism of Christ, said to be by Daniel da Volterra. The Transfiguration of Raphael was painted for this church and remained here till the French invasion. When it was returned from the Louvre, it was kept at the Vatican. Had it been restored to this church, it would have been destroyed in the siege of 1849 when the tribune and bell tower were thrown down. Here, in front of the high altar, the unhappy Beatrice Cenci was buried without any monument. Irish travelers may be interested in the gravestones in the nave. of Hugh O'Neill of Tyrone, Baron Dungannon, and O'Donnell of Tyrconnell, 1608. Near the door is the fine tomb, with the beautiful sleeping figure of Julian, Archbishop of Ragusa, Ob 1510, inscribed Bonus et mors et vita dulcis est. An inscription below the steps in front of the church commemorates the translation of a miraculous image of the Virgin hither in 1714. In the cloister is the Tempietto, a small domed building resting on 16 Doric columns, built by Bramante in 1502, on the spot where St. Peter's cross is said to have stood. A few grains of the sacred sand from the hole in the center of the chapel are given to visitors by the monks as a relic. St. Peter, when he was come to the place of execution, requested of the officers that he might be crucified with his head downwards, alleging that he was not worthy to suffer in the same manner his divine master had died before him. He had preached the cross of Christ, had borne it in his heart, and its marks in his body, by sufferings and mortification, and he had the happiness to end his life on the cross. The Lord was pleased not only that he should die for his love, but in the same manner himself had died for us, by expiring on the cross, which was the throne of his love. Only the apostle's humility made a difference, in desiring to be crucified with his head downward. His master looked toward heaven, which by his death he opened to men, but he judged that a sinner formed from dust, and going to return to dust, ought rather in confusion to look on the earth, as unworthy to raise his eyes to heaven. St. Ambrose, St. Austin, and St. Prudentius ascribe this, his petition, partly to his humility, and partly to his desire of suffering more for Christ. Seneca mentions that the Romans sometimes crucified men with their heads downward, and Eusebius testifies that several martyrs were put to that cruel death. Accordingly, the executioners easily granted the apostle his extraordinary request. St. Chrysostom, St. Austin, and St. Austerius say that he was nailed to the cross. Tertullian mentions that he was tied with cords. He was probably both nailed and bound with ropes. Alban Butler. The view from the front of the church is almost unrivaled. Behind it is the famous Fontana Paulina, whose name, by a curious coincidence, combines those of its architect, Fontana, and its originator. Paul V. It was erected in 1611 and is supplied with water from the lake of Bracciano by the aqueduct of the Aqua Trajana, 35 miles in length. The red granite columns, which divide the fountain, were brought from the temple of Minerva in the Forum Transitorium. The pleasant, natural sound of falling water, not unlike that of a distant cascade in the forest, may be heard in many of the Roman streets and piazzas when the tumult of the city is hushed. For consuls, emperors, and popes, the great men of every age have found no better way of immortalizing their memories than by the shifting, indestructible, ever new, yet unchanging upgush and downfall of water. They have written their names in that unstable element and proved it a more durable record than brass or marble. Hawthorne. Il ni a rien encore, dans quelques etat quasi soit, a opposer aux magnifiques fontaines quanvoit, a Rome dans les places et les carrefours, ni a l'abondance des eaux qui ne se sent jamais de couleur. Magnificence d'autant plus louable que l'utilité publique est joint. Duclos. A little beyond this fountain is the modern Porta S. Pancrazio, near the site of the ancient Porta Auralia, built by Pius Roman IX. In 1857, to replace a gate destroyed by the French under Oudinot in 1849. Many buildings outside the gate, injured at the same time, still remain in ruins. The lane on the right, inside the gate, leads to the Villa Lant, built in 1524 by Giulio Romano, for Bartolomeo de Pescia, secretary of Clement Roman VII. It still contains some frescoes of Giulio Romano, though they are only lately uncovered, as the house was used, until the last 2 years, as a succor sale to the convent of the Sacré-Cœur at the Trinità de Monte. Not far outside the gate are the church and convent of S. Pancrazio, founded in the 6th century by Pope Symmachus, but modernized in 1609 by Cardinal Tours. Here Crescenzio Nomentano, the famous consul of Rome in the 10th century, is buried. Here Narses, after the defeat of Totila, was met by the Pope and cardinals and conducted in triumph to St. Peter's to return thanks for his victory. Here also Peter Roman II. Of Aragon was crowned by Innocent Roman III, and Louis of Naples was received by John Roman XII. A flight of steps leads from the church to the catacomb of Calipodius, where many of the early popes and martyrs were buried. It has no especial characteristic to make it worth visiting. Another flight of steps leads to the spot where S. Pancrazio was martyred. His body rests with that of Saint Victor beneath the altar. A parish church in London is dedicated to Saint Pancras, in whose name kings of France used to confirm their treaties. In the persecution under Diocletian, this young saint, who was only 14 years of age, offered himself voluntarily as a martyr, defending boldly before the emperor the cause of the Christians. He was therefore beheaded by the sword, and his body was honorably buried by Christian women. His church, near the gate of S. Pancrazio, has existed since the year 500. Saint Pancras was in the Middle Ages regarded as the protector against false oaths and the avenger of perjury. It was believed that those who swore falsely by Saint Pancras were immediately and visibly punished, hence his popularity. Jameson's Sacred Art. Turning to the left from the gate, on the side of the hill between this and the Porta Portis, is the catacomb of S. Ponziano. Here is the only perfect specimen still extant of a primitive subterranean baptistry. A small stream of water runs through this cemetery, and at this one place the channel has been deepened so as to form a kind of reservoir, in which a certain quantity of water is retained. We descend into it by a flight of steps, and the depth of water it contains varies with the height of the Tiber. When that river is swollen so as to block up the exit by which this stream usually empties itself, the waters are sometimes so dammed back as to inundate the adjacent galleries of the catacomb. At other times, there are not above 3 or 4 feet of water. At the back of the font and springing out of the water is painted a beautiful Latin cross, from whose sides leaves and flowers are budding forth, and on the 2 arms rest 10 candlesticks, with the letters Alpha and Omega suspended by a little chain below them. On the front of the arch over the font is the baptism of our Lord in the river Jordan by St. John, while St. Abden, St. Senan, St. Miles, and other saints of the Oriental Church occupy the sides. These paintings are all of late date, perhaps of the 7th or 8th century, but there is no reason to doubt but that the baptistry had been so used from the earliest times. We have distinct evidence in the Acts of the Martyrs that the sacrament was not unfrequently administered in the cemeteries. The Roman Catacombs Northcote. In this catacomb is an early portrait of Christ, much resembling that at SS, Nerio Edicileo. The figure is, however, draped, and the whole work has certain peculiarities which appear to mark a later period of art. Both these portraits agree, if not strictly, yet in general features, with the description in Lentulus' letter to the Roman Senate. And portraits and descriptions together serve to prove that the earliest Christian delineators of the person of the Savior followed no arbitrary conception of their own, but were guided rather by a particular traditional type, differing materially from the Grecian ideal, and which they transmitted in a great measure to future ages. Kugler, I-16. In this vicinity are the catacombs of SS, Abden and Senan, of St. Julius and of Sta, Generosa. Opposite the Porta S. Pancrazio is the entrance of the beautiful Villa Pamphili-Doria, open to pedestrians and to 2-horse carriages after 12 o'clock on Mondays and Fridays, called by the Italians Bel Respiro. The casino contains a few, not first-rate, ancient statues, and some views of Venice in the 17th century by Heintius. The garden, for which a special permission must be obtained, is full of beautiful azaleas and camellias. From the ilex-fringed terrace in front of the casino is one of the best views of St. Peter's, which is here seen without the town backed by the Campagna, the Sabine Mountains, and the blue peak of Soracte. The road to the left leads through pine-shaded lawns and woods, and by some modern ruins to the lake, above which is a graceful fountain. A small temple raised in 1851 commemorates the French who fell here during the siege of Rome in 1849. The word Mary, in large letters of clipped box on the other side of the grounds, is a memorial of the late beloved Princess Doria, Lady Mary Talbot. Not far from this is a columbarium. The site of the Villa Doria was once occupied by the gardens of Galba, and here the murdered emperor is believed to have been buried. Uncertain Argius, autrefois esclave de Galba, ramassa son corps qui avait subi mille outrages, et à la lui crucer une humble sépulture, dans les jardins de son ancien maître. Mais il fallut retrieuver la terre. Elle avait été mutilée, et promenée par les goujets de l'armée. En fin Argius la trouva le lendemain, et la réunit au corps déjà brûlé. Les jardins de Galba étaient sur le janicule, prise de la voie Orléans, et en croit que le qui vit le dernier dénouement de cette affreuse tragédie est celui qu'occupe aujourd'hui la plus charmante promenade de Rome. Là où inclinant avec tant de grâce sur les pentes semées d'animons, et où dissinant si délicatement sur el azur du ciel et des montagnes leurs parasols élégants les pins de la villa Pamphili. Ampere, Emp Roman II. 80. The foundation of the Villa Pamphili Doria is due to the wealth extorted by Olympia Maldacchini during the reign of her brother-in-law, Innocent X. Innocent X fut, pour ainsi dire, contraint de fonder la maison Pamphili. Les casuists et les jurisconsultes levrant ses scrupules, car ils en avaient. Ils lui prouveront que le pape était en droit d'économiser sur les revenus du Saint-Siège pour assurer l'avenir de sa famille. Ils fixeront, avec une modération qui nous fait dresser les cheveux sur la tête, le chiffre des libéralités permises à chaque pape. Suivant you, le souverain pontife pouvait, sans abuser, établir un majorat de 4 000 francs de rente net, fonder une seconde gainature en faveur de quelques parents moins avantagés, et donner 900 000 francs de dot à chacune de ses nieces. Le général des Jesuits, R.P. Vitaleski, approuva cette décision. Là-dessus, Innocent X s'y mit à fonder la maison Pamphili, à construire le palais Pamphili, à créer la villa Pamphili, et à pamphiliser, tant qu'il put, les finances de l'église et de l'État. About Rome contemporaine. There are 2 ways of returning to Rome from the Villa Doria, one, which descends straight into the valley to the Porta Cavallegri, passing on the left the Church of Sta. Maria del Fornaci, the other, skirting the walls of the city beneath the Villa Lant, which passes a chapel, where St. Andrew's head, lost one day by the canons of St. Peter's, was miraculously rediscovered. On n'y voit pas de nouveaux monuments, religious y rapportant aux du apparitions de Pyrrhus en Italy. Seulement les augures firent rétablir le temple du des fouders nocturnes, le dietrusco sabin summenis, en expiation sans doubt de si que la terre de la statue de summenis. Placé sur le temple de Jupiter Capitoline, avait été détaché par la fouder, et après quan elle eut cherché en vain, retrouvé dans le Tiber. Je n'y compare pas, mais j'ai vu le long des murs de Rome, entre la porte Cavallegri et la porte Saint Pancrace, une petite chapelle élevée au lieu où Elon a retrouvé la terre de Saint André apporté solennellement de Constantinople à Rome au 15e siècle, et qui s'était perdu. Ampere Hist. Rom, Roman III. 55. Therefore farewell, ye hills, and ye envineyarded ruins. Therefore farewell, ye walls, palaces, pillars, and domes. Therefore farewell, far seen, ye peaks of the mythic Albano, seen from Montorio's height, Tiber, and Isula's hills. Ah, could we once ere we go, could we stand, while to ocean descending, sinks o'er the yellow dark plain slowly the yellow broad sun, stand from the forest emerging at sunset, at once in the champaign open, but studded with trees, chestnuts umbrageous and old, and in those fair open fields that incurve to thy beautiful hollow, Nemi embedded in wood, Nemi inurned in the hill. Therefore farewell, ye plains and ye hills and the city eternal, therefore farewell. We depart but to behold you again. A.H. Clough, Amours de Voyage,